She stood on the platform in a borrowed dress, waiting to meet a man who had paid for someone else's face. The telegram in Lydia's trembling hand was addressed to her sister, the beautiful one, the chosen one, the one who had run away 3 nights ago. Now Lydia was here instead, a substitute bride sent west to fulfill a contract she'd never signed, to marry a stranger who would surely send her back the moment he saw what disappointment looked like in female form. But when Caleb Rawlins stepped out of the crowd, his eyes didn't search for someone else. They landed on her and stayed there. If you want to know how a woman no one wanted became the only choice that mattered, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the February cold like a knife through butter, and Lydia Hawthorne pressed her forehead against the window, watching the endless Montana plains roll past in waves of snow and dead grass. She'd been traveling for 4 days now, each mile taking her further from everything she'd ever known and closer to a life that was never supposed to be hers. The dress she wore had been sewn for Charlotte, perfect Charlotte, with her honey blonde curls and rosebud mouth, Charlotte who could make men forget their own names with a single smile. The cream-colored silk hung loose at Lydia's shoulders and gathered awkwardly at her waist, a constant reminder that she was filling a space meant for someone else. She'd pinned and tucked where she could, but there was no hiding the fundamental truth. This dress, like the marriage contract in her carpet bag, had been tailored for a different woman entirely. "Next stop, Black Ridge," the conductor called, his voice booming through the passenger car. Lydia's stomach twisted. She pulled out the telegram one more time, though she'd already memorized every word. Contract agreed. Marriage arranged. Bride expected March 1st. Black Ridge Ranch. C. Rawlins. It had arrived at her father's house 6 months ago, before everything had fallen apart, before the bank had threatened foreclosure, before her father's pride had crumbled into desperation, before Charlotte had fled in the night with the Reverend's son, leaving nothing but a note and the wreckage of a business arrangement that was supposed to save them all. The marriage broker had been clear. Caleb Rawlins was wealthy, respected, and looking for a wife of good breeding to help manage his vast Montana ranch. He'd seen Charlotte's photograph, sent by their father without telling either daughter, and had agreed to terms. Money had already changed hands. Contracts had been signed. The Hawthorne family debt would be forgiven upon marriage, but Charlotte was gone, and so they'd sent Lydia instead. "He won't know the difference until it's done," her father had said, unable to meet her eyes. "Your sisters. Similar enough. By the time he realizes, it'll be too late to back out without scandal." Similar enough. As if Lydia's dark hair and serious gray eyes were merely a slightly faded copy of Charlotte's golden perfection. As if the absence of beauty were just a minor clerical error, easily overlooked. Lydia had wanted to refuse. The words had burned in her throat for 3 days while her mother altered Charlotte's trousseau to fit her plainer frame, while her father drank himself quiet in his study, while the weight of their survival settled onto her shoulders like a yoke. But she hadn't refused, because she was the good daughter, the sensible one, the one who understood duty even when it tasted like ash. Because saying no would mean watching her parents lose everything. Because some part of her, some small, pathetic part she despised, wondered if maybe, just this once, she could be wanted for herself. The train began to slow. Lydia gathered her things with shaking hands. 1 carpet bag, 1 hat box, 1 trunk being unloaded from the freight car, everything she owned in the world, packed for a life she'd never imagined living. She caught her reflection in the window, pale skin, dark circles under her eyes from 4 sleepless nights, lips pressed thin with anxiety. Not beautiful, not even pretty, just adequate, just there. The train shuddered to a stop. Through the window, Lydia could see the platform. It was bigger than she'd expected, bustling with activity despite the cold. Cowboys in heavy coats, ranch hands loading supplies, a few scattered townspeople meeting arrivals. And standing apart from all of them, tall and still as a fence post, was a man in a black Stetson, Caleb Rawlins. Even at a distance, even through dirty glass, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the way people gave him space without seeming to notice they were doing it. Power radiated from him like heat from a stove. This was a man who owned things, land, cattle, people's respect, a man who had paid good money for a beautiful wife to grace his successful ranch. Lydia's throat closed. She couldn't do this. She couldn't step off this train and watch his face change when he realized what he'd gotten instead of what he'd bargained for. She couldn't endure that first moment of disappointment, the way his eyes would search past her for the woman who was supposed to be there. The conductor appeared at her shoulder. "Miss, this is your stop." "I know." Her voice sounded strange, distant. "I just need a moment." "Train leaves again in 20 minutes. You coming or going?" Coming or going, as if she had a choice, as if there were anywhere else in the world she could run where debt and duty wouldn't follow. Lydia stood. Her legs felt uncertain beneath her, but they held. They always held. That was what Lydia did. She endured. She'd been enduring her whole life, standing in Charlotte's shadow, wearing Charlotte's hand-me-downs, accepting Charlotte's leftover suitors when they'd drunk enough to forget which sister was which. This was just one more thing to endure. She stepped onto the platform, and the Montana wind hit her like a physical blow. It cut through the inadequate silk dress, found every gap in her wool coat, and reminded her exactly how far from home she was. The air smelled different here, snow and pine and wood smoke, underlaid with something wild she couldn't name. The man in the black Stetson turned. Lydia froze. She'd expected someone older, harder. The marriage broker had described Caleb Rollins as a self-made man, someone who'd built his fortune through discipline and determination. She'd imagined weather-beaten skin and cold eyes, someone practical enough to order a bride like he might order breeding stock. But Caleb Rollins was young, 30 at most, and he was looking directly at her. His eyes were blue. Even from 20 feet away, she could see that. Blue like deep water, like the sky before a storm. They swept over her once, taking in her ill-fitting dress, her white-knuckled grip on her carpet bag, the terror she couldn't quite hide. Then they came back to her face and held there. He didn't look disappointed. He looked curious. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs as he crossed the platform toward her. He moved like someone who'd spent his life working, efficient, economical, nothing wasted. When he stopped in front of her, she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He was easily 6 feet tall, maybe more, with broad shoulders that filled out his wool coat and hands that looked like they could break a man in half without much effort. "Miss Hawthorne?" His voice was deep, roughened by weather and use. This was it. This was the moment where she had to lie, had to pretend to be Charlotte, had to hope he wouldn't notice the substitution until it was too late. But the lie stuck in her throat. Looking up into those steady blue eyes, she couldn't do it. She couldn't start this marriage, this life, with a deception, even though that's exactly what her father had told her to do. "Yes," she managed. "I'm Lydia Hawthorne." Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. He waited, as if expecting her to say more. When she didn't, he held out his hand. "Caleb Rollins. Welcome to Montana." Lydia stared at his hand. It was gloved in worn leather, scarred and strong. She placed her own much smaller hand in it, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. The handshake was firm, brief, and somehow more intimate than anything she'd experienced before. When he released her, she felt the absence of warmth immediately. "Is this all your luggage?" He gestured to her carpet bag and hat box. "There's a trunk, in the freight car." He nodded and called over a young ranch hand who'd been hovering nearby. "Tommy, fetch the lady's trunk, the one marked Hawthorne." "Yes, sir, Mr. Rollins." The boy darted toward the freight car with obvious eagerness to please. Caleb turned back to Lydia. "The wagon's just over here. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. I brought blankets. It'll be cold." He started walking, clearly expecting her to follow. Lydia did, her mind racing. He'd called her the lady. He hadn't used Charlotte's name, hadn't mentioned the photograph, hadn't said anything about expecting someone else. Maybe he simply couldn't tell the difference yet. Maybe all women looked the same to him and he wouldn't notice he'd gotten the wrong sister until later, when it was too late to refuse her. The wagon was sturdy and well-maintained, like everything else she'd seen associated with Caleb Rollins so far. He helped her up onto the bench seat with the same impersonal efficiency he'd shown with the handshake, then arranged a heavy wool blanket over her lap. His hands were quick and capable, tucking the edges without asking permission, making sure she was secure against the wind. "Thank you," Lydia said quietly. He glanced at her, those blue eyes unreadable. You'll need to dress warmer than that if you're planning to stay. Montana isn't kind to silk dresses. If you're planning to stay, the words hung between them like a question he wasn't quite asking. Did he already doubt she would stay? Had he already decided she wasn't worth keeping? Before Lydia could respond, Tommy returned with her trunk, huffing under its weight. Caleb took it from him as if it weighed nothing and secured it in the wagon bed with practiced ease. Then he climbed onto the bench beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses. They moved forward, leaving the platform behind. Black Ridge fell away quickly. It wasn't much of a town, just a handful of buildings clustered around the train station and what looked like a general store. Beyond it stretched an endless expanse of snow-covered plains, broken occasionally by dark clusters of pine trees and the distant shadows of mountains. The sky was huge here, bigger than any sky had a right to be, pressing down with all that empty space. Lydia pulled the blanket tighter around herself and tried not to think about how far she was from everything she'd ever known. "How was the journey?" Caleb asked after several minutes of silence. "Long." She hesitated, then added, "But the scenery was beautiful. Once we reached the mountains." "You like mountains?" "I've never seen them before. Not real ones. We have hills in Pennsylvania, but nothing like this." He made a sound that might have been agreement. "Montana's different from the East. Harder, lonelier. Some people can't adjust." "Is that what happened to the last woman?" The question came out before Lydia could stop it, sharp with anxiety she couldn't quite hide. Caleb's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "There was no last woman. You're the first I've brought out here." "Oh." Lydia didn't know if that made things better or worse. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have assumed." "It's a reasonable question." He glanced at her again, a longer look this time. "You're wondering why a man would send for a bride instead of finding one locally." Lydia flushed. "It's not my business." "It will be if you stay." He returned his attention to the road ahead. "The truth is simple enough. I don't have time for courting. The ranch takes up every hour I've got, and then some. I need a wife who can manage a household, handle correspondence, oversee the domestic staff, and represent the ranch when I'm not available. That requires someone educated, capable, and willing to work. Those aren't qualities easy to find in a woman also willing to marry a rancher she's never met." The words were practical, almost clinical. A job description, not a marriage proposal. Lydia should have found it comforting. At least he wasn't expecting romance or pretending to feelings he didn't have. But instead, it made her chest ache with something that felt dangerously close to disappointment. "I can do those things," she said quietly. "Manage a household, handle correspondence. I kept my father's books for years. I'm good with numbers and organization." "I know." Lydia turned to stare at him. "Lydia, you know?" The marriage broker provided references. Your school teachers, your minister, several family friends. They all spoke highly of your capabilities. Her heart began to pound. "But the photograph was of your sister." Caleb's voice remained steady, almost gentle. "Charlotte Hawthorne, 18 years old, accomplished in music and needlework, noted for her exceptional beauty." The marriage broker was quite enthusiastic about her prospects. The blood drained from Lydia's face. "Then you know. You know I'm not the woman you agreed to marry." "No," Caleb said, and his tone carried something she couldn't identify. "You're not." The wagon wheels crunched through snow. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely. Lydia sat frozen, waiting for him to turn the wagon around, to take her back to the train station and send her home in disgrace. But he didn't turn around. He kept driving, his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins. "Are you sending me back?" Lydia finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want to go back?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted. Not her father when he told her to take Charlotte's place. Not her mother when she'd altered the wedding dress. Not the marriage broker who'd arranged everything without her knowledge or consent. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what I want anymore." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost thoughtful. "Your father wrote to me 3 weeks ago. Explained the situation, that Charlotte had eloped, that he was sending you instead, that he hoped I would honor the contract despite the substitution." He paused. "He also sent a different photograph. One of you." Lydia's breath caught. And you still let me come? I told him I would meet you at the station and we would discuss the arrangement from there. Caleb glanced at her, and for the first time, something almost like warmth touched his expression. I don't make decisions sight unseen, Miss Hawthorne. Not about cattle, not about land, and certainly not about marriage. But you must be disappointed. Charlotte is... She's beautiful, and I'm... Different, Caleb interrupted. Not worse. Different. The word hung in the cold air between them. Different. Not a replacement, not a consolation prize, just different. Lydia didn't know what to do with that. The wagon crested a hill and suddenly the ranch spread out before them. Black Ridge Ranch. Even at a distance, it took her breath away. The main house was massive, 2 stories of dark wood and stone with a wide porch wrapping around the front and smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Beyond it stretched barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and what looked like an entire small village of outbuildings. Cattle dotted the snowy fields in dark clusters, and she could see men working even in the late afternoon cold, their movements small and purposeful against the vast landscape. It's enormous, Lydia breathed. 10,000 acres, Caleb said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. I started with 100 12 years ago, built the rest through work and luck and not knowing when to quit. You built all this yourself? Myself and about 50 ranch hands who know cattle better than I ever will. He guided the horses down the hill toward the house. The ranch is everything, Miss Hawthorne. It's my past, my present, and my future. Any woman who marries me needs to understand that she's not just marrying a man, she's marrying this land, this work, this life. It's not easy, it's not romantic, but it's honest. Honest. The word resonated through Lydia like a bell. When had anyone in her life been honest with her? Her father had lied about the marriage contract. Charlotte had lied about her intentions. Even Lydia herself had planned to lie, to pretend to be someone she wasn't until it was too late for this man to refuse her. But Caleb Rollins was being honest. Brutally, completely honest. She could be honest too. I wasn't supposed to tell you, Lydia said suddenly. About Charlotte. About the substitution. My father told me to let you think I was her until after the wedding, until you couldn't back out without scandal. She turned to face him fully, meeting those blue eyes despite the fear clawing at her throat. But I can't do that. I can't start a marriage with a lie, even if it means you send me home, even if it means my family loses everything. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop just outside the main house. He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Why not? He asked finally. Why not lie, if the stakes are that high? Because... Lydia struggled to find words for something she'd never articulated before. Because I've spent my whole life being invisible, being the consolation prize, being the one people settled for when they couldn't have what they really wanted. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of pretending I don't notice, tired of being grateful for crumbs, tired of apologizing for existing. Her hands clenched in her lap. If you're going to reject me, I'd rather it be for who I actually am than for failing to be someone else. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the horses' breathing and the distant sound of men working in the corrals. Lydia's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She'd done it now, spoken the truth, burned the bridges, destroyed whatever small chance she'd had at making this work. But at least she'd been honest. Caleb climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side. He held up his hand to help her down, those blue eyes never leaving her face. Then we understand each other, he said quietly, because I don't want Charlotte Hawthorne. I never did. Lydia took his hand, her mind reeling. What? I want someone who can think. Someone who won't wilt the first time Montana shows its teeth. Someone who tells the truth even when lying would be easier. He steadied her as she stepped down, his hand strong and warm around hers. The marriage broker sent me a dozen photographs of beautiful women. I chose Charlotte Hawthorne because her references mentioned a sister who ran the household, capable, educated, not afraid of hard work. His mouth quirked slightly. I was hoping to meet that sister when I invited your family to send a bride. Lydia stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. You wanted me? From the beginning? I wanted someone real, Caleb corrected. Someone who could be a partner, not an ornament. When your father's letter arrived explaining the substitution, I'll admit I was concerned. But then I read your letter. My letter? I didn't write you a letter. Your father enclosed it with his explanation. You'd written to Charlotte, trying to talk her out of eloping, trying to explain why the marriage contract mattered, why honor mattered. Caleb released her hand but didn't step back. That letter told me more about who you are than any photograph could. It told me you were someone who understood duty and responsibility, someone who cared about more than just her own desires. Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. That letter had been private, desperate, written in the middle of the night when she'd discovered Charlotte's plans. She'd poured out all her fears, all her anger at their father's desperation and Charlotte's selfishness. She'd begged her sister to reconsider, not for love of Caleb Rollins, but for love of their family, and Charlotte had left it behind when she ran away. That letter was never meant for your eyes, Lydia whispered. I know. That's why I trusted it. Caleb took a step back, putting professional distance between them again. Here's what I'm proposing, Miss Hawthorne. Stay for a month. Learn the ranch. Learn the work. Learn what this life actually requires. At the end of that month, we'll both decide if this arrangement makes sense. If you want to leave, I'll pay your passage home and send your father enough money to satisfy his debts. No questions asked. No judgments made. If you want to stay, we'll marry and figure out the rest as we go. But the contract, I'll honor the contract either way. Your family's debts will be settled. He held her gaze. But I won't marry a woman who doesn't choose to be here. I won't build a marriage on obligation alone. So the choice is yours, Lydia Hawthorne. What do you want? What did she want? Looking up at this strange, honest man standing in front of this enormous ranch in the middle of nowhere, Montana, Lydia realized she didn't know. She'd spent so long being what other people needed that she'd forgotten how to want anything for herself. But she had a month to figure it out. I'll stay, she said. For a month, and then I'll decide. Something that might have been approval flickered across Caleb's face. Fair enough. He turned toward the house. Let's get you inside before you freeze to death. I'll have Mrs. Reeves show you to your room and help you get settled. We eat dinner at 6. I'll expect you in the dining room then, and we can discuss the household arrangements. He started walking, assuming she would follow. Lydia did, her mind still spinning, her emotions a tangled mess she couldn't begin to sort through. The front door opened before they reached it, and a tall, stern-looking woman in her 50s appeared on the porch. She had iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that could probably freeze water at 20 paces. Mr. Rollins, she said, her voice crisp, your bride has arrived, I see. Mrs. Reeves, this is Miss Lydia Hawthorne. She'll be staying in the guest wing for the next month while we finalize arrangements. Caleb's tone was firm, brooking no argument. Please see that she has everything she needs and introduce her to the household staff. Mrs. Reeves's eyes swept over Lydia with the same assessing look Lydia had endured her whole life, measuring, evaluating, finding her wanting. But whatever the housekeeper thought, she kept it to herself. Of course, sir. Miss Hawthorne, if you'll follow me. Caleb tipped his hat to Lydia. Until dinner. Then he was gone, striding toward the barns with that same efficient purpose, leaving Lydia alone with the forbidding Mrs. Reeves. The housekeeper led her inside without a word. The house was as impressive inside as out. High ceilings with exposed beams, hardwood floors covered with beautiful rugs, furniture that was simple but clearly expensive. Everything was immaculate, perfectly maintained, and somehow still masculine. This was a bachelor's house, organized and efficient but lacking any softness, any personality beyond function. Mrs. Reeves led her up a wide staircase to the second floor. The master's chambers are in the east wing, she said, her tone carefully neutral. The guest wing is here, in the west. You'll have a bedroom, sitting room, and private bath. The household staff consists of myself, 2 maids, and a cook. We maintain standards here at Black Ridge Ranch, Miss Hawthorne. Mr. Rollins expects everything to run smoothly. I understand, Lydia said quietly. Mrs. Reeves opened a door and stepped back to let Lydia enter. The room was lovely, spacious and clean, with a large 4-poster bed, a fireplace already burning cheerfully, and windows that looked out over the snowy fields. A far cry from the cramped, shabby room she'd shared with Charlotte back home. Dinner's at 6 sharp, Mrs. Reeves said. I'll have Mary bring hot water for washing at 5:30. Is there anything you need immediately? No, thank you. This is perfect. The housekeeper nodded once and left, closing the door behind her with a definitive click. Alone for the first time in days, Lydia sank onto the edge of the bed and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Caleb Rollins had known about the substitution. He'd known she was coming instead of Charlotte. And he'd chosen her anyway. Or at least he'd chosen to give her a chance. A month. She had a month to prove herself, to decide if this life was something she could not just endure, but actually choose. Lydia stood and moved to the window, looking out over the vast ranch. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow orange and pink. Men were heading toward the bunkhouses, their day's work done. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. It was beautiful. Harsh and lonely, and completely unfamiliar, but beautiful. For the first time in her life, Lydia Hawthorne wasn't standing in someone else's shadow. She wasn't the disappointing sister, the practical daughter, the woman men settled for when they couldn't have Charlotte. Here, she was just herself. Unknown, unproven, but at least undeniably real. She didn't know yet if that would be enough, but she had a month to find out. When the maid knocked at 5:30 with washing water, Lydia was ready. She'd unpacked her trunk, hung up the few dresses she owned, and prepared herself mentally for dinner with Caleb Rollins. Mrs. Reeves had laid out what Lydia assumed was appropriate dinner attire, a simple gray wool dress, practical but well made. Lydia dressed carefully, pinned her dark hair into a neat bun, and studied herself in the mirror. She looked exactly like what she was. A serious woman of 22, neither beautiful nor ugly, someone easily overlooked in a crowd. But her eyes were clear, her posture straight, and her hands steady. That would have to be enough. She made her way downstairs at precisely 6 o'clock. Voices led her to the dining room, a large space dominated by a long table that could easily seat 20. Currently, only 2 places were set, one at the head and one to its right. Caleb stood when she entered, his earlier work clothes replaced by clean trousers and a pressed shirt. He'd shaved and combed his hair, though it still showed a tendency to wave at the temples. Without his coat and hat, he looked younger, more approachable, but no less formidable. Miss Hawthorne. He pulled out her chair. Mr. Rollins. Lydia sat, acutely aware of the intimacy of dining alone with him. Back home, such a thing would have been scandalous. Here, apparently, it was simply practical. Caleb reclaimed his seat at the head of the table. How did you find your room? Very comfortable, thank you. Mrs. Reeves has been most efficient. She runs this house like a military campaign. I'm rarely here for meals, so she's not used to accommodating guests. I hope she wasn't too unwelcoming. She was perfectly professional. Caleb's mouth quirked slightly. That's a diplomatic way of saying she was cold as January ice. Before Lydia could respond, a young woman in a maid's uniform appeared with their first course, a rich beef soup that smelled incredible. Lydia realized she hadn't eaten anything substantial since yesterday. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Caleb didn't seem uncomfortable with the quiet, but Lydia felt increasingly aware of every sound. Her spoon against the bowl, her own breathing, the crackle of the fire in the nearby hearth. Finally, Caleb set down his spoon and looked at her directly. I should explain what I meant earlier, about the month. All right. Being a rancher's wife isn't like being a society wife back east. You won't host tea parties or organize charity balls. You'll manage a household that includes 3 indoor staff and, during peak season, up to 60 ranch hands who need to be fed, clothed, and kept from killing each other. He leaned back in his chair. You'll handle correspondence with suppliers, buyers, and business associates. You'll need to understand cattle prices, weather patterns, and when to trust the foreman's judgment versus when to get me involved. When I'm away on cattle drives or business, you'll be the authority here. People will look to you for decisions. Lydia's hands tightened on her napkin. That sounds like far more than managing a household. It is. I need a partner who can run half this operation while I run the other half. If that's not something you're capable of or interested in, it's better to know now. And if I fail during this trial month, then you'll have learned something valuable about yourself, and I'll have learned I need to reconsider my requirements. Caleb's expression remained neutral. But I don't think you'll fail, Miss Hawthorne. Why not? Because you're still here. You could have stayed on that train. You could have lied about who you were. You could have refused to come west in the first place. He tilted his head slightly. But you didn't. You're here, you told the truth, and you're sitting across from me right now instead of falling apart. That tells me you're stronger than you think. The maid returned to clear their soup bowls and served the main course, roasted beef with potatoes and winter vegetables. Lydia used the interruption to gather her thoughts. You're very direct, Mr. Rollins. I don't have time for games. Do you prefer I be less honest? No. The word came out more firmly than she intended. No, I appreciate honesty. I've had enough of pretty lies and polite deceptions to last a lifetime. Something that looked almost like respect flickered across his face. Then we'll be honest with each other, starting now. He cut into his beef with precise movements. Ask me whatever you want to know. About the ranch, about this arrangement, about me. Nothing is off limits. Lydia considered him for a long moment. This was more than she dared hope for, a chance to understand exactly what she was agreeing to before committing to it. But it also meant being brave enough to ask the questions that frightened her most. Why aren't you married already? She asked. You're successful, respected, still young. Surely there were women locally who would have been interested. There were, Caleb acknowledged. But most of them were interested in what marrying me could give them: status, wealth, escape from whatever life they already had. None of them were interested in the actual work. He met her eyes. I grew up dirt poor, Miss Hawthorne. My father drank himself to death, and my mother died of pneumonia when I was 14. I built this ranch with my own 2 hands, and more luck than I probably deserved. I can't respect a woman who wants the results of that work without being willing to contribute to it herself. So you want a business partner who happens to be female? I want a partner, he corrected. Business, domestic, and eventually, God willing, personal. But I'm practical enough to know that those things develop in order, not all at once. Eventually. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. He was talking about a real marriage, not just a business arrangement, but he was also acknowledging that intimacy couldn't be forced or rushed. Your turn, Caleb said. Ask me something else. What happens if I stay the month and decide to leave? You said you'd still pay my father's debts. Why would you do that if I refuse to marry you? Because the debt isn't your fault, and you've already sacrificed enough trying to fix your family's problems. His voice was matter of fact. Besides, making you stay through financial coercion wouldn't give me what I actually need. I need someone who chooses to be here. Choose. That word again. Lydia had never had much practice at choosing. Her life had always been dictated by duty, by Charlotte's needs, by her father's expectations. The idea that someone wanted her to choose, that her choice mattered, was as terrifying as it was thrilling. They finished dinner with surprisingly easy conversation. Caleb told her about the ranch's history, about the challenges of Montana winters and the constant threat of wolves and disease. He explained the cattle market, the importance of the railroad, the delicate balance of maintaining good relationships with neighboring ranches while still protecting his own interests. Lydia found herself leaning forward, genuinely interested. This wasn't the polite small talk she was used to. It was real information, practical knowledge about a life she might actually live. And Caleb talked to her like she could understand it, like her comprehension mattered. Tomorrow, Caleb said as they finished dessert, Mrs. Reeves will take you through the household operations. You'll meet the staff, see how meals are planned and prepared, learn how the household accounts are managed. The day after, I'll show you the ranch itself, just an overview since you're not dressed for outdoor work yet. We'll need to get you proper clothing if you're going to be here for a month. I can wear what I have. Those dresses are too fine for ranch work and too thin for Montana cold. We'll send for the dressmaker tomorrow. Consider it part of the household expenses. But if I leave, then you'll leave with warm clothes, Caleb interrupted. And if you stay, you'll already have what you need. Either way, it's a practical investment. Lydia couldn't argue with that logic, though it felt strange to have someone spend money on her without strings attached. Caleb stood, signaling the end of the meal. I'll say goodnight now. I have ledgers to review, and you must be exhausted from traveling. Lydia rose as well. Mr. Rollins, I thank you for your honesty, for giving me this chance. He studied her face for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Hawthorne. You haven't seen what you're agreeing to." But as Lydia made her way back upstairs to her comfortable room, to her private space, and her moment of choice, she thought maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see exactly what she was agreeing to. And it wasn't nearly as frightening as she'd expected. It was simply real. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through Lydia's window and a knock at her door promptly at 7 o'clock. She'd been awake for over an hour, unable to sleep past dawn despite her exhaustion, her mind replaying every moment of the previous day until the memories felt worn smooth as river stones. "Miss Hawthorne?" It was Mary, the young maid who'd brought washing water the night before. "Mrs. Reeves says breakfast is ready, and she'll meet you in the kitchen afterward to begin your tour." Lydia dressed quickly in one of her simpler day dresses, a navy wool that had seen better days but was at least practical, and made her way downstairs. The house felt different in morning light, less intimidating somehow. She could hear sounds from the kitchen, smell coffee and bacon, hear the low murmur of voices somewhere deeper in the house. The dining room was empty when she arrived, but a single place had been set with coffee, fresh bread, eggs, and bacon. A note in bold masculine handwriting rested beside her plate. "Gone to check the north pasture. Back by afternoon. C.R." Lydia sat down alone, oddly disappointed. She'd expected to see Caleb at breakfast, had prepared herself for more of his direct questions and unsettling honesty. Instead, she ate in solitude, the large house quiet around her except for distant kitchen sounds. Mrs. Reeves appeared exactly as Lydia finished her coffee. "Good morning, Miss Hawthorne. I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you." "Then let's begin. We have a great deal to cover if you're to understand how this household operates." The housekeeper's tone was brisk, professional, revealing nothing of what she might think about Lydia's presence or purpose here. "The kitchen first, I think." She led Lydia through a door at the back of the dining room into a large, immaculately organized kitchen. A woman in her 40s stood at the massive cast-iron stove, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed from heat. She looked up as they entered, her expression curious but guarded. "Miss Hawthorne, this is Mrs. Chen, our cook. She's been with Mr. Rollins for 8 years and knows his preferences better than he does himself. Mrs. Chen, Miss Hawthorne will be learning the household operations." Mrs. Chen wiped her hands on her apron and offered a small nod. "Miss, you have any dietary restrictions I should know about? Allergies? Things you can't abide?" The question was so practical, so matter-of-fact, that Lydia felt some of her tension ease. "No, nothing like that. Everything you've prepared so far has been excellent." "Well, cooking for one man who barely notices what he eats isn't much of a challenge," Mrs. Chen said with the faintest hint of amusement. "Nice to have someone at the table who might actually taste the food." "Mr. Rollins eats in town most evenings, Mrs." Reeves explained, her tone suggesting disapproval, "or takes meals with the hands in the bunkhouse. He rarely uses the dining room except for business dinners." "Then why—" Lydia caught herself, but Mrs. Chen finished the question for her. "Why does he bother keeping formal household staff? Because appearances matter in business, and Mr. Rollins knows it. When buyers come, when neighboring ranchers visit, when the bank sends representatives, they see a well-run household. They assume a well-run ranch." Mrs. Chen turned back to her stove. "He's practical about everything, that one. Nothing wasted. Everything in its place." Mrs. Reeves cleared her throat, a sound that somehow conveyed both agreement and a reminder about discretion. "The kitchen operates on a strict schedule. Breakfast at 7, dinner at noon for the house and bunkhouse both, supper at 6. During calving season or roundup, we may serve as many as 60 men 3 times a day. Mrs. Chen plans menus a week in advance and provides me with supply lists every Monday." For the next hour, Lydia learned the intricate workings of the Black Ridge kitchen, where supplies were kept, how orders were placed with the general store in town, the rotation of dishes designed to use every scrap and waste nothing. Mrs. Chen explained her system with obvious pride, showing Lydia the massive pantry stocked with preserved foods, the root cellar where vegetables lasted through the winter, the careful accounting that ensured they never ran short but never over-ordered. "A household this size, you can't afford carelessness," Mrs. Chen said, running her finger down a neatly written inventory list. One mistake in ordering and you've got 60 hungry men and no flour. Or you've ordered too much and it spoils before you can use it. Either way, it's money wasted, and Mr. Rollins doesn't abide waste. He built this ranch from nothing, Mrs. Reeves added, her stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. Watched every penny until he could afford not to. Old habits die hard. They moved on to the rest of the house. The parlor that was rarely used, the library stocked with agricultural journals and cattle breeding records alongside a surprising collection of novels, the office where Caleb managed his business affairs. Mrs. Reeves showed Lydia the household accounts, thick ledgers recording every expenditure, every supply order, every wage paid. Mr. Rollins reviews these monthly, the housekeeper explained. He'll expect you to maintain them if you stay. Can you manage figures? Yes. Lydia ran her finger down a column of entries, noting the neat handwriting, the careful categorization. I kept my father's books for years. This is much better organized than anything I worked with before. That's all Mr. Rollins is doing. He insisted on a proper system from the start. Mrs. Reeves closed the ledger with a decisive thump. A ranch this size, you need to know where every dollar goes. Otherwise, you wake up one day with debt collectors at your door and no idea how you got there. Something in her tone suggested she'd seen exactly that happen to someone else. Lydia wondered about Mrs. Reeves's history, how she'd ended up managing a bachelor's household in the middle of Montana, but didn't ask. The housekeeper's rigid posture didn't invite personal questions. They were in the upstairs hallway, Mrs. Reeves explaining the linen rotation schedule, when Mary came hurrying up the stairs. Mrs. Reeves, the dressmaker's here. Mr. Rollins sent word to town first thing this morning, and she came right out. Mrs. Reeves nodded briskly. Show her to the morning room. We'll be down directly. She turned to Lydia. Mr. Rollins doesn't waste time when he's made a decision. Come along. The morning room was a smaller, more comfortable space off the main parlor, with good light from south-facing windows. A middle-aged woman with measuring tape draped around her neck stood examining fabric samples spread across a table. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes assessing Lydia with professional interest. Mrs. Kowalski, this is Miss Hawthorne, Mrs. Reeves said. She requires a complete wardrobe suitable for ranch life. So Mr. Rollins said in his note. Mrs. Kowalski gestured to a chair. Sit down, dear, and let's see what we're working with. You're smaller than I expected from his description, but that's easily managed. For the next 2 hours, Lydia stood, turned, and held still while Mrs. Kowalski measured, pinned, and made notes in a small book. The dressmaker worked with brisk efficiency, asking practical questions about Lydia's daily activities and preferences, showing no curiosity about why Caleb Rollins was suddenly ordering an entire wardrobe for a woman. You'll need sturdy day dresses in dark colors, navy, brown, gray, Mrs. Kowalski said, making notes. Nothing fancy, but well made. Wool for winter, lighter cotton for summer. I'll make them with fuller sleeves so you can move freely, and the skirts practical for walking. How do you feel about split skirts for riding? I don't ride, Lydia admitted. Mrs. Kowalski glanced up. You will if you stay here. Can't manage a ranch from indoors. We'll make 2 split skirts just in case. And you'll need proper coats, a heavy wool for winter, something lighter for spring, gloves, scarves, a decent hat that won't blow off in the wind. She tallied numbers in her book. I can have the first few dresses ready in a week, the rest within a month. That's very fast. Mr. Rollins pays well for quick work, and I've got 2 daughters who sew as fine as I do. We'll manage. Mrs. Kowalski began packing up her samples. I'll send word when the first fitting is ready. Any particular colors you favor? Lydia thought of Charlotte's pastel dresses, the soft pinks and lavenders that had looked so beautiful on her golden sister and so washed out on Lydia's darker coloring. I usually wear darker shades. They're more practical. Practical is good, but there's no harm in a bit of color where it suits. Mrs. Kowalski tilted her head, studying Lydia's face. Deep green would look well on you, and burgundy. I'll include 1 or 2 pieces in better colors. You'll want something decent for church or social occasions. After the dressmaker left, Mrs. Reeves continued the tour. They visited the bunkhouse at a distance. The men's domain, not appropriate for you to enter without Mr. Rollins present, the housekeeper said firmly, and the various barns and outbuildings that supported the ranch operations. Everywhere Lydia looked, she saw the same careful organization, the same evidence of thoughtful planning and disciplined execution. "Mr. Rollins runs a tight operation," Mrs. Reeves said as they walked back toward the house. "He's fair but exacting. The men respect him because he works harder than any of them and never asks anyone to do something he won't do himself. But he doesn't tolerate laziness or carelessness. If you stay, you'll need to maintain the same standards." "And if I don't?" Lydia asked quietly. "If I decide to leave at the end of the month?" Mrs. Reeves stopped walking and turned to face her fully. For the first time, the housekeeper's stern expression softened into something almost sympathetic. "Then you'll leave, and life will go on. But I'll tell you something, Miss Hawthorne, since you seem like a sensible woman. I've worked for Mr. Rollins for 6 years, and I've never seen him bring a woman to this ranch. Never seen him show interest in marrying, never heard him discuss the matter with anyone. When he sent for a mail-order bride, every person in this house was shocked." She paused. "Whatever his reasons for choosing this path, they matter to him. He's not a man who makes frivolous decisions." "I know that," Lydia said, "but that doesn't mean I'm the right choice for him." "Maybe not, but at least have the courage to find out before you run." Mrs. Reeves's tone sharpened slightly. "Seems to me you've spent your whole life being told you weren't enough. Might be worth discovering if that's actually true or just something you believed because other people needed you to." The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. She stared at the housekeeper, wondering how this stern woman had seen straight through to the core of her deepest insecurity. Mrs. Reeves's expression returned to its usual professional neutrality. "Dinner is at noon. I suggest you rest before then. This afternoon, Mr. Rollins plans to show you the ranch proper, and you'll need your strength." Lydia spent the late morning in her room, trying to process everything she'd learned. The ranch was even larger and more complex than she'd imagined. The household operations alone would be a full-time occupation, and that was before considering all the other responsibilities Caleb had described: correspondence, business decisions, managing relationships with neighbors and suppliers. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was also more interesting than anything Lydia had ever done in her life. Back home, her days had been filled with monotonous domestic tasks: mending Charlotte's dresses, helping her mother with cooking and cleaning, keeping her father's increasingly chaotic books while he drank away their future. There had been no challenge in it, no opportunity to prove herself capable of anything beyond basic survival. Here, she would be challenged every single day, expected to learn, to grow, to contribute something meaningful. The question was whether she was brave enough to try. At noon, she made her way back to the dining room. This time, Caleb was there, already seated at the head of the table, reading through a stack of papers while he waited. He looked up when she entered and immediately set the documents aside. "Miss Hawthorne, how was your morning with Mrs. Reeves?" "Educational," Lydia said, taking her seat. "Your household is remarkably well organized. Mrs. Reeves is doing. She could run a military campaign if she set her mind to it." He waited while Mary served their meal: beef stew with fresh bread. "Did the dressmaker come?" "Yes. She's very efficient. She'll do good work, her prices are fair, and she doesn't gossip." Caleb broke open his bread, steam rising from the soft interior. "This afternoon, I thought we'd ride out to see the ranch. Nothing too strenuous, just an overview of the property, meet some of the key hands. You'll need to borrow one of Mary's riding skirts for now, until Mrs. Kowalski finishes yours." Lydia's stomach clenched. "I told you, I don't ride." "I know. That's why we're starting with an easy mount and flat terrain." He said it as if the matter was already settled. "You can't manage a ranch if you can't travel beyond the front porch. Learning to ride is essential." "I could learn to drive a wagon instead." "You'll learn both, but riding is faster and more practical for daily operations." Caleb's tone wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "I'm not asking you to become an expert horsewoman in a month, but I am asking you to try." It was the first time he'd pushed her on anything, the first time his expectations had felt like demands. Lydia wanted to refuse, to explain that she'd always been terrified of horses, that Charlotte had been the one who took riding lessons while Lydia stayed safely on the ground. But Charlotte wasn't here. and Lydia was tired of being the sister who stood on the sidelines, too afraid to try. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll try." Something that might have been approval flickered across Caleb's face. "Good. We'll take it slow. If you're genuinely frightened, we'll stop. But I think you might surprise yourself." After dinner, Mary helped Lydia change into borrowed clothing, a split skirt that felt scandalously practical and a heavy coat that actually fit Montana's cold. When Lydia came downstairs, Caleb was waiting on the front porch with 2 horses already saddled. One was a massive black gelding that shifted and tossed its head with barely contained energy. The other was a smaller mare, brown and placid, who stood perfectly still while Caleb checked her saddle. "This is Rosie," he said, running a hand down the mare's neck. "She's 18 years old, steady as a rocking chair, and hasn't spooked at anything in her entire life. She'll take care of you." Lydia approached cautiously. The horse was much larger up close than she'd expected, powerful and intimidating despite her gentle demeanor. Rosie turned her head to look at Lydia with one large, dark eye, then went back to dozing in the weak afternoon sun. "Give me your hand," Caleb said. Lydia extended her hand and he guided it to Rosie's neck. The mare's coat was warm and surprisingly soft under her palm. Lydia felt the solid muscle beneath, the living warmth, the patient stillness. "She's beautiful," Lydia whispered. "She's practical," Caleb corrected, but his tone was gentle. "Now, mounting. Put your left foot in the stirrup. I'll boost you up." The next few minutes were awkward and embarrassing. Lydia couldn't seem to coordinate her movements properly, and even with Caleb's help, she struggled to get herself into the saddle. But he was patient, offering guidance without frustration, adjusting her position once she was finally seated. Heels down, back straight, hands light on the reins. "Rosie knows what to do. You're just along for the ride right now." Caleb swung himself onto the black gelding with an ease that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. The big horse danced sideways, eager to move, but Caleb controlled him with barely visible signals. "Ready?" he asked. No, Lydia thought, but she nodded anyway. They started walking, Rosie following Caleb's horse without any guidance from Lydia needed. The motion was strange, rolling and rhythmic, nothing like riding in a wagon. Lydia gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles, certain she was about to fall. "Relax it," Caleb called back to her. "You're fighting her movement instead of moving with her. Take a deep breath and let your body adjust to her rhythm." It took several minutes, but gradually Lydia began to understand what he meant. When she stopped tensing against every step, when she let her hips move with the horse instead of resisting, the ride became smoother. Not comfortable exactly, but manageable. They rode across the snowy fields at a walk, Caleb pointing out landmarks and explaining the ranch's layout. The north pasture where cattle wintered, the south range where they'd graze come spring, the creek that provided water year-round fed by mountain snowmelt, the line of trees marking the boundary with the neighboring ranch. 10,000 acres sounds enormous until you see it on horseback, Caleb said. Then you realize how much ground you need to cover just to check on your stock, how many miles you ride in a single day during roundup. They crested a small rise, and Caleb pulled his horse to a stop. Lydia managed to halt Rosie beside him, feeling a small surge of accomplishment that she'd controlled the mare at all. From here, she could see the full scope of Black Ridge Ranch spread out below. The main house and outbuildings, the vast pastures dotted with cattle, the mountains rising in purple shadows to the west. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Men moved between the barns, small as toys at this distance, going about their work. "This is what I'm offering you," Caleb said quietly. "Not just a marriage, not just a house. All of this, the work, the responsibility, the challenges. It's beautiful, but it's also brutal. Montana doesn't forgive mistakes, and ranching doesn't allow for weakness. The winters are harsh, the work is endless, and you'll spend more time solving problems than enjoying success." He turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes serious in the afternoon light. "I need you to understand that before you make any decisions. This isn't a fairy tale where the poor girl marries the rich man and lives happily ever after. This is a partnership that will demand everything you have and then ask for more. If you stay, if you marry me, you'll work harder than you ever have in your life. You'll face problems you've never imagined. You'll be lonely sometimes, frustrated often, and exhausted most of the time." Lydia met his gaze, her heart pounding. Then why would anyone choose this? Because it's real, Caleb said simply. Because what you build here, you build with your own hands and your own will. Because at the end of a hard day, you can look out over this land and know that it's yours, that you earned it, that no one can take it from you. He paused. And because there's a kind of beauty in something that demands your best and then rewards you with exactly what you put in. No lies, no pretense, just honest work and honest results. The wind picked up, cold against Lydia's face, carrying the scent of pine and snow and wood smoke. Below them, the ranch continued its daily operations, indifferent to their conversation, constant as the turning seasons. I'm not beautiful, Lydia said suddenly. I'm not charming or accomplished or any of the things men usually want in a wife. I can keep books and manage a household, but I don't know anything about ranching. I've never made a decision that mattered to anyone but myself. What if I fail? What if I'm not enough? What if you are? Caleb countered. What if everything you think is a weakness is actually exactly what this place needs? You're practical, you're honest, you're not afraid of hard work. You walked into a stranger's house and spent the morning learning operations instead of hiding in your room. You're sitting on a horse right now despite being terrified because you understood it was necessary. His voice softened. Maybe the question isn't whether you're enough. Maybe it's whether you're brave enough to find out. Lydia looked out over the ranch again. This vast enterprise built by one man's determination and sustained by constant effort. It was intimidating. It was impossible. It was also the first thing in her life that felt like it might actually be worth choosing. I'm scared, she admitted. Good, Caleb said. Fear means you understand the stakes. Now, let's see if you're curious enough to keep going anyway. They rode for another hour, Caleb introducing her to several of the ranch hands they encountered. The men were polite but wary, clearly uncertain about this unexpected woman in their midst. Tom Hayes, the foreman, was a weathered man in his 50s who assessed Lydia with the same measuring look she'd gotten from Mrs. Reeves. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat, you planning to stay or just visiting? I'm deciding, Lydia said honestly. Tom nodded slowly. Fair enough. Well, if you do stay, you'll need to learn the difference between a heifer and a steer, and which one you want to keep versus which one you want to sell. Mr. Rollins can explain it better than I can, but the basics matter if you're going to help run this operation. I'd like to learn, Lydia said. Something in Tom's expression shifted. Not quite approval, but perhaps a willingness to reserve judgment. Then I expect we'll be seeing more of you, ma'am. By the time they returned to the house, Lydia's legs were trembling with fatigue, and parts of her body she'd never thought about were aching fiercely. But she'd stayed on the horse for the entire ride. She'd kept her seat, maintained control, and even managed to enjoy a few moments when fear gave way to exhilaration. Caleb helped her dismount, his hand steadying her when her legs nearly buckled. You did well for a first ride. I'm going to be impossibly sore tomorrow, Lydia said. Yes, you are. Hot bath tonight, and we'll take tomorrow off from riding. But the day after, we'll go again. He led the horses toward the barn, clearly expecting her to follow. It gets easier. The first few rides are always the hardest. In the barn, Lydia watched as Caleb unsaddled both horses with practiced efficiency, showing her how to remove the tack, where everything belonged, how to check the horses for injuries or problems. He talked while he worked, explaining his philosophy about horse care, about the relationship between rider and mount. A horse isn't a machine, he said, running a brush down Rosie's flank in long, smooth strokes. She's a partner. You take care of her, and she'll take care of you. Neglect her, and she'll let you down when you need her most. It's honest that way. You get exactly what you give. Everything with this man came back to honesty, Lydia thought. Honest work, honest relationships, honest expectations. There was something both brutal and refreshing about it. No room for illusions, but also no room for the kind of deceptions that had poisoned her entire life before now. That evening at dinner, Caleb asked her about her impressions of the ranch, listened carefully to her observations, and answered her questions with the same directness he'd shown from the beginning. When she mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the operation, he didn't dismiss her concerns or offer empty reassurance. You should feel overwhelmed, he said. It is overwhelming, but overwhelming doesn't mean impossible. It just means you have to take it one piece at a time, Learn what you need to learn when you need to learn it, and trust that competence builds gradually. How long did it take you to feel competent? Lydia asked. Caleb's mouth quirked. Ask me in another 10 years and I'll tell you. Over the next week, Lydia fell into a routine that was unlike anything she'd known before. Mornings with Mrs. Reeves, learning the intricate systems that kept the household running smoothly. Afternoons with Caleb, riding out to different parts of the ranch, meeting more of the hands, absorbing information about cattle and horses and land management. Evenings alone in her room, reading through the agricultural journals Caleb had suggested, trying to make sense of terminology and concepts she'd never encountered. She fell into bed exhausted every night and woke each morning with new aches in new places. But she also woke curious, eager to learn more, increasingly invested in understanding how all the pieces of this vast operation fit together. The ranch hands began to nod to her when they passed, no longer quite so wary. Mrs. Chen started asking her opinion on menu planning. Mrs. Reeves actually smiled once when Lydia caught an error in the household accounts. And Caleb continued to treat her like someone whose thoughts mattered, whose capabilities were worth developing, whose presence made a difference. On the 8th day, Lydia's new dresses arrived. Mrs. Kowalski had outdone herself, sturdy, practical garments in dark colors, but cut to actually fit Lydia's frame, with small touches of craftsmanship that elevated them beyond mere utility. And as promised, there was one dress in deep green that made Lydia's gray eyes look almost luminous. She wore the green dress to dinner that night, feeling self-conscious but also pleased. When she entered the dining room, Caleb looked up from his papers and went very still. "That color suits you," he said quietly. It was the first personal comment he'd made about her appearance, and Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mrs. Kowalski chose it. She said it would look well. She was right. Caleb's eyes held hers for a long moment before he looked away, clearing his throat. "I have something to discuss with you. A neighboring rancher, James Sutherland, is hosting a dinner party next week. He invited me and specifically mentioned bringing my fiancée." He paused. "I declined, but I wanted you to know the invitation exists. If you'd like to attend, to meet some of the other ranchers and their wives, I can send word that we've reconsidered." Lydia's stomach tightened. A dinner party meant scrutiny, questions, people assessing her and finding her wanting. It meant facing the social judgment she'd been avoiding her entire life, but it also meant being seen publicly with Caleb, being introduced as his intended wife, being treated as if she belonged at his side. "What would people think if we don't attend?" she asked. "That I'm antisocial and focused on work, which is what they already think," Caleb said dryly. "My absence wouldn't surprise anyone, but your presence might help establish you in the community if you decide to stay." If you decide to stay, always that choice, offered and reoffered, never forced. "I'd like to go," Lydia said, surprising herself. "If the invitation is still open," Caleb nodded slowly, "then I'll send word tomorrow. The dinner is next Saturday. It will be formal, probably 20 or 30 guests, and people will have questions." He met her eyes. "Are you prepared for that?" "No," Lydia admitted. "But I don't think I'll ever feel prepared, so I might as well try anyway." For the first time since she'd met him, Caleb Rollins smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "That," he said, "is exactly the right answer." The week leading up to the Sutherland dinner party passed in a blur of nervous preparation and mounting anxiety. Lydia practiced her riding daily, pushing through the soreness until she could mount and dismount without Caleb's help, until she could guide Rosie with something approaching confidence. Mrs. Reeves drilled her on the names and relationships of the prominent ranching families, their histories and alliances, the subtle hierarchies that govern Montana society. "The Sutherlands have the second largest ranch in the territory," Mrs. Reeves explained during one of their sessions in the library. "James Sutherland inherited from his father, married well, and has maintained his position through careful business relationships. His wife Eleanor fancies herself the social arbiter of the region. She'll be evaluating you the moment you walk through the door." "That's comforting," Lydia said dryly. Mrs. Reeves's expression softened slightly. "You'll do fine. Just remember, you're Mr. Rollins's choice. That carries weight, Whether people want to acknowledge it or not, he's respected here. His opinion matters. And if he's vouching for you, most people will at least give you a fair chance. Most people. Not everyone. Lydia understood what the housekeeper wasn't saying, that some would judge her regardless, would see her as an outsider, would question why Caleb Rollins had sent for a mail-order bride instead of choosing from the local options. On Saturday evening, Lydia dressed in the green gown Mrs. Kowalski had insisted on making, a more formal version of the day dress, with delicate black trim and a neckline that was modest but flattering. Mary helped pin her dark hair into an elegant arrangement, weaving in a simple ribbon that matched the dress. When Lydia examined herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Not beautiful, never that, but dignified. Composed. Someone who might plausibly belong at a rancher's side. Caleb was waiting in the front hall, dressed in a black suit that transformed him from weathered rancher to gentleman. His hair was neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved, and when he looked up at her descending the stairs, something flickered in his blue eyes that made Lydia's breath catch. "You look lovely," he said quietly. "You look different without dust on your boots," Lydia replied, and was rewarded with that rare, transforming smile. "I clean up passably when required." He offered his arm. "Ready to face the lions?" Lydia placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid strength of him through the fine wool. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the Sutherland Ranch took 40 minutes in the covered buggy Caleb had prepared. He drove himself, the reins easy in his capable hands, and for the first time since Lydia had arrived, they had extended time alone together without the structure of meals or ranch business. "Nervous?" Caleb asked after several minutes of silence. "Terrified," Lydia admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if they ask questions I can't answer?" "Then you tell them the truth. That you're learning, that you're new to Montana, that you're still deciding if this life suits you." He glanced at her. "You don't have to pretend to be something you're not, Lydia. That's not what I'm asking of you." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formal Miss Hawthorne, and the intimacy of it startled her. But it also felt right somehow, natural, as if they'd crossed some invisible threshold during the past 2 weeks. "What will you tell them?" she asked. "About us? About this arrangement?" "The truth in broad strokes. That we corresponded through a marriage broker, that you came to Montana to see if we'd suit, that we're still in the process of determining compatibility." His voice was matter of fact. "Most of them already know. News travels fast in ranching country, and my sending for a bride was unusual enough that people took notice. They'll be curious, but if we present a united front, they'll accept it." A united front. Lydia turned the phrase over in her mind, trying to imagine presenting anything united with this man she barely knew. But Caleb seemed unconcerned, his attention on the road ahead, his posture relaxed. The Sutherland house appeared over a rise, blazing with light against the dark Montana sky. It was larger than Blackridge's main house, more ornate, with columns flanking the entrance and manicured grounds that must require constant attention. Buggies and horses crowded the circular drive, and Lydia could hear music and laughter drifting from the open windows. Caleb pulled up to the entrance and handed the reins to a waiting stable boy. He came around to help Lydia down, his hands steady at her waist, and for a moment they stood close together in the lamplight from the house. "Whatever happens in there," Caleb said quietly, his blue eyes serious, "remember that you're here because I chose you. Not because you're a replacement for someone else. Not because you're convenient. Because after reading your sister's letter, after learning who you actually are, I wanted you here." He paused. "That's the truth, Lydia. Hold on to it when things get difficult." Before she could respond, the front door opened and a distinguished man in his 50s appeared, his face breaking into a broad smile. "Rollins, about time you showed up. We were beginning to think you'd lost your nerve and stayed home with your ledgers." James Sutherland descended the steps, hand extended. "And this must be the famous Miss Hawthorne we've all been hearing about." Caleb shook his hand firmly. "James, good to see you. May I present Miss Lydia Hawthorne?" "Lydia, James Sutherland, my neighbor and occasional business partner." Lydia offered her hand, and James took it with old-fashioned courtesy, bowing slightly. "Delighted, Miss Hawthorne, truly delighted. It's about time someone convinced this stubborn bachelor to consider matrimony. Welcome to Montana." "Thank you, Mr. Sutherland. You have a beautiful home." "My wife's doing entirely. I'd be content with a bunkhouse and a good barn, but Eleanor has more refined sensibilities." He gestured toward the house. Come in, come in. Everyone's eager to meet you both." The entrance hall was elegant, all polished wood and expensive wallpaper, with a grand staircase sweeping up to the second floor. A maid took their coats, and James led them toward the sound of conversation and music coming from a large parlor to the right. Lydia's stomach clenched as they entered. The room was full of well-dressed people, easily 30 guests, as Caleb had predicted, all turning to look as James announced their arrival. "Everyone, may I present Caleb Rollins and his fiancée, Miss Lydia Hawthorne." Fiancée. The word hung in the air like a declaration, and Lydia felt the weight of 24 assessing gazes. She wanted to disappear, to flee back to the buggy and the safety of Black Ridge Ranch. But Caleb's hand found the small of her back, a gentle pressure that steadied her, and she forced herself to smile. A woman glided forward, tall and elegant in deep blue silk, her blonde hair perfectly arranged and diamonds glittering at her throat. This could only be Eleanor Sutherland, the social arbiter Mrs. Reeves had warned about. "Miss Hawthorne, what a pleasure." Eleanor's voice was cultured, her smile perfectly calibrated. "We've been absolutely dying to meet you. Caleb has been so secretive about his romantic interests. Most of us didn't even know he had any until word arrived that he'd sent for a bride." "Mrs. Sutherland," Lydia said, grateful her voice stayed steady. "Thank you for including me in your invitation." "Well, we couldn't very well leave you out, could we? Everyone in the territory wants to know who finally captured Caleb Rollins's heart." Eleanor's eyes swept over Lydia with practiced assessment. "You're from Pennsylvania, I understand. How are you finding Montana? It must be quite different from what you're accustomed to." "Very different," Lydia admitted, "but beautiful. The landscape is unlike anything I've seen before." "Yes, it's all very dramatic and wild," Eleanor said with a delicate laugh. "Though I confess, I sometimes miss the refinements of civilization. One does get starved for proper society out here." She turned to Caleb. "You must bring Miss Hawthorne by for tea next week. I'm sure she'd appreciate female companionship while she's adjusting to ranch life." It was graciously said, but Lydia caught the subtle condescension in it, the implication that she needed help adjusting, that she was out of her depth. Before she could formulate a response, another woman approached, younger than Eleanor, but cut from the same elegant cloth. "Miss Hawthorne, I'm Caroline Mitchell. My husband owns the ranch bordering Black Ridge to the east. We're practically neighbors." Caroline's smile seemed more genuine than Eleanor's calculated courtesy. "I heard you've been learning to ride. How brave. I grew up in the saddle and can't imagine approaching horses for the first time as an adult." "It's been challenging," Lydia said carefully, "but Mr. Rollins has been patient, and the mare he chose for me is remarkably steady." "Oh, you must mean Rosie. That dear old thing has been around forever." Caroline leaned in conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think Caleb keeps her specifically for visitors who need a gentle mount. She's practically bomb-proof." Several other women joined the conversation, some genuinely welcoming, others clearly there to satisfy curiosity. Lydia answered questions about her journey, her first impressions of Montana, her plans for the wedding. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Caleb standing slightly behind her, a solid presence that never quite left her side even when the men drew him into their own conversations. Dinner was announced, and they moved to a dining room that could have accommodated 50 guests comfortably. Place cards directed everyone to assigned seats, and Lydia found herself between Caleb on her right and an older rancher named Thomas Brennan on her left. "So you're the woman who finally got Rollins to settle down," Thomas said as the first course was served. "That's quite an accomplishment. I've known this boy since he started his ranch with 100 acres and more determination than sense. Never thought I'd see him married." "We're not married yet," Lydia pointed out. "We're still getting to know each other," Caleb interrupted smoothly. "Miss Hawthorne is wise enough to make sure we're compatible before making final commitments." Thomas chuckled. "Compatibility's overrated if you ask me. My wife and I fought like cats and dogs for the first 5 years, but we figured it out eventually. Marriage is work, same as ranching. You put in the effort, you get results." Across the table, Eleanor Sutherland set down her wine glass with delicate precision. Of course, it's so much easier when both parties enter marriage with similar backgrounds and expectations. Shared experience creates natural harmony. Her eyes found Lydia's. Tell me, Miss Hawthorne, what experience do you have with ranch management? I understand you come from a city background. The question was politely phrased, but clearly designed to expose Lydia's inadequacies. Around the table, conversation quieted slightly as others tuned in to hear her response. My family lived in a town, not a city, Lydia said carefully, and I have no experience with ranching at all, but I do have experience managing complex household operations, maintaining business accounts, and adapting to changing circumstances. I'm hoping those skills will transfer as I learn the specifics of ranch life. How refreshingly honest, Eleanor said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. So many young women these days try to claim expertise they don't possess. It's good that you're willing to acknowledge your limitations. The condescension was unmistakable now, and Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, Caleb's voice cut across the table, cold and precise. Lydia's honesty is one of the qualities I value most about her. She doesn't pretend to knowledge she doesn't have, which means when she does learn something, she learns it thoroughly and correctly. His blue eyes met Eleanor's without flinching. I've met plenty of people who claim expertise in areas where they're actually incompetent. Give me an honest novice over a confident fraud any day. Silence fell around the table, the rebuke unmistakable despite Caleb's even tone. Eleanor's smile froze, and James Sutherland quickly intervened with a story about cattle prices, steering the conversation to safer ground. Under the table, Lydia felt Caleb's hand brush against hers briefly, a gesture of solidarity that no one else could see. Her heart hammered as she realized he'd just publicly defended her, had drawn a line that even Eleanor Sutherland wouldn't dare cross again. The rest of dinner passed more smoothly. Lydia spoke when spoken to, asked intelligent questions about Montana ranching, and generally tried to project competence without arrogance. Caroline Mitchell proved a genuine ally, sharing stories about her own adjustment to ranch life and offering practical advice. Several of the men engaged Caleb in business discussions that Lydia found herself following with interest, her experience with her father's books giving her enough foundation to understand the economic principles being discussed. After dinner, the party moved back to the parlor for music and dancing. Lydia stood near one of the tall windows watching couples take the floor when Caleb appeared at her elbow. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. Lydia's heart jumped. "I'm not very accomplished." "Neither am I. But we should probably make an appearance." His voice lowered. "Besides, it'll give us an excuse to escape Eleanor's line of questioning for a few minutes." Despite her nerves, Lydia smiled. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse?" Caleb led her onto the floor as a waltz began. His hand settled at her waist, warm and sure, and he guided her into the pattern with surprising grace for a man who claimed no expertise. Lydia focused on following his lead, on not stepping on his feet, on maintaining the proper distance, even as she was acutely aware of how close they were. "You handled Eleanor well," Caleb said quietly. "She's used to intimidating people." "You handled her better. I don't think anyone's challenged her quite so directly in years." "Someone should have done it sooner." His blue eyes met hers. "I won't let anyone diminish you, Lydia. Not Eleanor Sutherland, not anyone else. You're here as my equal, my potential partner. If people can't respect that, they can keep their opinions to themselves." The words settled around Lydia's heart like a warm blanket. No one had ever defended her before, had ever stood between her and social judgment. Charlotte had been the one worth defending, worth protecting. Lydia had always been expected to absorb criticism quietly, to accept her lesser status without complaint. But Caleb Rollins didn't see her as lesser. He saw her as equal, as worthy of respect and defense. They danced in silence for several turns around the room. Lydia became aware of people watching them, of whispered conversations at the room's edges. She caught Caroline Mitchell's approving smile, James Sutherland's satisfied nod, Eleanor's carefully neutral expression that didn't quite hide her displeasure. "They're talking about us," Lydia murmured. "Let them talk. They'd find something to gossip about regardless." Caleb's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Are you all right? We can leave if this is too much." "I'm all right," Lydia said, and realized it was true. Yes, people were watching. Yes, she'd been subtly attacked and put on display, but she'd survived it. She'd held her own, with Caleb beside her, and the world hadn't ended. The music concluded and they separated with the formal courtesy the dance required. But before they could leave the floor, a commotion at the parlor entrance drew everyone's attention. A late arrival stood in the doorway, and Lydia's blood turned to ice. Charlotte. Her sister stood framed in the entrance like a vision from a dream, golden hair cascading over her shoulders, wearing a dress of pale pink silk that made her look like a porcelain doll come to life. She was breathtaking, ethereal, everything Lydia had never been and never would be. And she was looking directly at Caleb Rollins with wide, innocent blue eyes. "I'm so sorry to arrive late," Charlotte said, her voice carrying that musical quality that had always made men's faces soften. "The journey from Bozeman took longer than expected, and I simply had to freshen up before making an appearance. I do hope I haven't missed too much." Eleanor Sutherland recovered first, her social instincts overriding her surprise. "Not at all, my dear. Welcome. Though I'm afraid I don't believe we've been introduced." Charlotte glided into the room with the unconscious grace that had always come so naturally to her. "I'm Charlotte Hawthorne, Lydia's sister." Her eyes found Lydia's across the room, and for just a moment something cold flickered in their blue depths. "I've come to see how my dear sister is settling into her new life." The room had gone absolutely silent. Every eye moved from Charlotte to Lydia to Caleb, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. Lydia felt frozen, her mind unable to process what was happening. Charlotte was supposed to be in Pennsylvania with the Reverend's son. Charlotte was supposed to be married by now, out of reach, no longer a factor in Lydia's life. Charlotte was not supposed to be here, in Montana, at a dinner party, looking like everything Lydia could never be. Caleb's hand found Lydia's elbow, a grounding touch that reminded her to breathe. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly level, revealing nothing. "Miss Charlotte Hawthorne, your arrival is unexpected." "I imagine it is," Charlotte said with a tinkling laugh. "Poor Lydia must be quite surprised. We haven't seen each other since she left for Montana." She moved closer, and Lydia caught the scent of the expensive perfume Charlotte had always favored, the one their mother had saved for months to buy her. "When I heard that my sister was out here trying to fulfill the contract that was meant for me, I simply couldn't stay away. Families should support each other, don't you think?" The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Charlotte was the intended bride, Lydia merely the substitute. And now the real thing had arrived to reclaim what was rightfully hers. James Sutherland, bless him, attempted to diffuse the tension. "Well, this is certainly a reunion. Miss Charlotte, you must be exhausted from your journey. Perhaps you'd like to sit down, have some refreshment." "Actually," Charlotte interrupted, her eyes still locked on Caleb, "I was hoping I might have a word with Mr. Rollins, in private. There are matters we should discuss, given the circumstances." The audacity of it stole Lydia's breath. Charlotte had abandoned the marriage contract, had run away with another man, and now she was here demanding a private audience with the man she'd rejected. It was beyond presumptuous, it was insulting. But before Lydia could find her voice, before she could protest or object, or do anything besides stand there feeling small and inadequate beside her radiant sister, Caleb spoke. "No." The single word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Charlotte's perfect smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Caleb's tone was polite but utterly final. "I have no interest in private conversations with you, Miss Charlotte. Anything you need to say can be said here, in front of everyone, or not at all." Charlotte's eyes widened, genuine shock replacing her calculated charm. "But surely you want to understand what happened, why I couldn't come initially." "I understand perfectly," Caleb interrupted. "You were contracted to marry me. You chose to break that contract and elope with someone else. Your father sent Lydia in your place. That's all I need to know." "But I'm here now," Charlotte said, and for the first time Lydia heard desperation creeping into her sister's voice. "I've come all this way. I've reconsidered my decisions. I'm willing to honor the original agreement. The original agreement no longer exists." Caleb's hand moved from Lydia's elbow to her hand, his fingers threading through hers in a gesture visible to everyone in the room. "I'm engaged to Lydia. She's the woman I invited to Montana. She's the woman I've been getting to know for the past 3 weeks. She's the woman I intend to marry." Lydia's heart stopped. They weren't engaged. Not really. Not formally. The month wasn't even half over. Caleb was supposed to be deciding, evaluating, determining if she was adequate for his purposes. But he was claiming her. In front of everyone, in front of Charlotte, he was choosing her. Charlotte's face went pale beneath her careful cosmetics. "You can't be serious. You contracted for me. I'm the one in the photograph. The one who was offered." "You were offered and found wanting," Caleb said, his voice cutting through her protests like a knife. "You broke your word, abandoned your family's obligations, and left your sister to clean up your mess. Now you've apparently left whoever you eloped with and come here thinking I'd welcome you with open arms." He paused, his blue eyes cold. "I wouldn't have welcomed you 3 weeks ago. I certainly don't welcome you now." The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. Eleanor Sutherland looked torn between scandalized horror and delighted interest in the unfolding drama. Caroline Mitchell's eyes were wide with sympathy. James Sutherland seemed to be trying very hard to disappear into the wallpaper. Charlotte's mask cracked completely, her pretty face contorting with anger and humiliation. "This is absurd. You can't possibly prefer her to me. Look at her. She's plain, she's difficult, she's nothing special. I'm the beautiful one. I'm the one men want." "You're the one who ran away," Caleb said flatly. "Lydia is the one who stayed. You're the one who breaks her promises. Lydia is the one who keeps her word. You're the one who thinks her appearance entitles her to special treatment. Lydia is the one who's willing to work." His hand tightened around Lydia's. "I don't want beauty that runs at the first sign of difficulty. I want strength that endures. And Lydia has strength you'll never understand." Lydia felt tears burning behind her eyes. But they weren't tears of shame or inadequacy. They were something else entirely, something fierce and bright, and almost painful in their intensity. Charlotte stared at them both, her chest heaving with emotion she couldn't quite control. "You'll regret this. When the novelty wears off, when you realize what you've given up." "I've given up nothing," Caleb said. "I've gained a partner. Now I suggest you find somewhere else to stay tonight, because you're not welcome at Black Ridge Ranch." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, real ones this time, not the calculated displays Lydia had seen her use to manipulate their father. "Lydia, please, you're my sister. Tell him he's making a mistake." Lydia found her voice at last, and it came out stronger than she'd ever heard it before. "The only mistake was thinking I should apologize for not being you." She stepped closer to Caleb, feeling his solid presence beside her. "You ran away because you didn't want this life. I'm here because I'm choosing to try. That's the difference between us, Charlotte. It always has been." For a long moment, the sisters stared at each other across the expanse of the Sutherland parlor. All their history hung between them. Every time Charlotte had been chosen first, every time Lydia had been the consolation prize, every time beauty had triumphed over substance. But for once, for the first time in Lydia's entire life, substance had won. Charlotte turned and fled, her pink silk skirt swishing behind her, leaving a wake of shocked silence. Eleanor Sutherland recovered with remarkable speed. "Well, that was certainly entertaining. James, I think perhaps we should serve coffee in the other room and give everyone a chance to settle themselves." The suggestion was clearly a dismissal, an attempt to end the evening before any more drama could unfold. Guests began moving toward the indicated room, conversations starting up again in hushed, excited tones. Lydia knew they would be the topic of gossip for months. Caleb turned to their hosts. "James, Eleanor, thank you for your hospitality, but I think it's best if we take our leave." Of course," James said quickly. "Perfectly understandable. We'll have your buggy brought around." Within minutes, they were in the cold night air, Caleb helping Lydia into the buggy with the same care he'd shown earlier. But everything felt different now. Charged, electric, heavy with words unspoken. They were half a mile from the Sutherland ranch before either of them spoke. "I'm sorry," Caleb said finally. "I shouldn't have claimed we were engaged without asking you first. But I couldn't let her stand there and suggest you were somehow less than her, that you were second choice." "Was it true?" Lydia interrupted. "What you said about choosing me? About wanting strength instead of beauty?" Caleb pulled the horses to a stop in the middle of the dark road. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the moonlight. Every word. I could have sent you home the day you arrived. I could have waited for Charlotte to show up eventually. I could have broken the contract entirely and started over with someone else. His voice was low, intense. But I didn't. Because you're exactly what I told those people in there. You're strong, you're honest, you keep your promises. You show up even when you're terrified. You try even when you think you'll fail. And that matters more to me than any amount of conventional beauty ever could. I don't understand, Lydia whispered. Charlotte is everything you should want. She's empty, Caleb said bluntly. Beautiful and empty. I could see that from her letters, from the way your father described her, from every reference the marriage broker provided. She's been taught that her appearance is her only value, and she's never developed anything beyond it. Whereas you, he reached out and gently touched Lydia's cheek. You've had to develop depth, capability, resilience. You've had to become someone substantial because no one was going to value you for surface qualities alone. Lydia's breath caught at the touch, at the intimacy of his hand against her skin. So I'm valuable because no one ever thought I was beautiful? You're valuable because you made yourself valuable through your own effort. Beauty is an accident of birth. Character is a choice. Caleb's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. And you have more character in your little finger than Charlotte has in her entire body. She'll tell everyone back home what happened, Lydia said. She'll make sure my parents know I took her place, that you chose me over her. My father will be furious. Your father sent you here knowing it was a substitution. If he's furious, that's his problem to manage, not yours. Caleb's hand dropped, but his eyes never left hers. Unless you want to go back? Unless seeing Charlotte made you realize you'd rather return to your old life than stay here with me? It was the same choice he'd been offering since she arrived, but this time it felt different. This time it came with the memory of his hand in hers, his public declaration, his absolute certainty that she was worth choosing. This time it came with the knowledge that someone saw her, truly saw her, and didn't find her wanting. No, Lydia said, her voice steady. I don't want to go back. I want to stay. For the rest of the trial month? For however long you'll have me. Something blazed in Caleb's eyes. Triumph, relief, something deeper that Lydia couldn't quite name. Then we should probably make this official. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I've been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment. I'm not sure this qualifies as the right moment, but it's honest, and honesty seems to be our theme. He opened the box to reveal a ring, not ostentatious, not dripping with jewels, but a beautiful sapphire flanked by small diamonds, set in gold that gleamed in the moonlight. Lydia Hawthorne, will you marry me? Not as a substitute for your sister, not as a convenient solution to your family's debts, but as yourself. As the woman I've come to know these past weeks, as the partner I want beside me for whatever challenges come next. Will you choose this life? Choose this ranch? Choose me? Lydia looked at the ring, at Caleb's serious face, at the vast Montana night surrounding them. 3 weeks ago, she'd been on a train heading toward obligation and dread. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a terrified woman trying to learn impossible skills. 1 week ago, she'd been wondering if she'd ever be brave enough to choose anything for herself. Now she knew the answer. Yes, she said. I choose yes. Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. The sapphire caught moonlight as Lydia turned her hand, watching the ring glitter against her work-roughened fingers. Caleb gathered the reins and urged the horses forward again, and they rode in silence toward Black Ridge Ranch. But it was a different silence than before, warm, weighted with promise and possibility. When they reached the house, Caleb helped her down from the buggy with hands that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary. You should rest, he said quietly. Tomorrow, people will start talking. The next few weeks won't be easy. I know, Lydia met his eyes. But we'll face it together. Something shifted in his expression, a softening she'd never seen before. Yes, together. He was right about the talking. By Monday morning, 3 separate visitors had arrived at Black Ridge Ranch on transparent pretexts, each one clearly there to assess the situation and gather details for the rumor mill. Caroline Mitchell came first, bringing a basket of preserves and an expression of genuine concern. "I wanted to make sure you were all right after Saturday," Caroline said, as Mrs. Reeves ushered her into the parlor where Lydia had been reviewing household accounts. "That must have been dreadful, having your sister appear like that." "It was unexpected," Lydia said carefully, pouring tea with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "But ultimately clarifying." Caroline's eyes went to the sapphire ring on Lydia's left hand, and her face broke into a warm smile. "Oh, how wonderful! So it's official then? You and Caleb are truly engaged?" "Yes. He proposed Saturday night after we left the party." "I'm so glad. Honestly, Lydia, I've never seen Caleb react to anyone the way he reacted when your sister tried to insert herself. He was absolutely firm." Caroline leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, Eleanor Sutherland has been trying to match him with various society women for years. She'll be apoplectic that he chose someone she considers beneath their circle." "I gathered she wasn't pleased," Lydia said dryly. "Eleanor's never pleased when someone disrupts her carefully managed social order. But don't let her intimidate you. Half the women in this territory can't stand her, and the other half only pretend to because they're afraid of her sharp tongue." Caroline accepted her tea with a grateful nod. "You have more allies than you realize. What Caleb said about strength and endurance, that resonated with a lot of us who've built lives out here. Montana doesn't have much patience for delicate flowers." The words were comforting, but Lydia knew Caroline's support wouldn't be universal. The second visitor proved that point definitively. Eleanor Sutherland herself arrived shortly after Caroline left, sweeping into the parlor with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to deference. "Miss Hawthorne, or should I say, Mrs. Rollins-to-be." Eleanor's smile was sharp as cut glass. "I felt obligated to call and express my concerns about Saturday evening's unfortunate scene." "That's kind of you," Lydia said, though kindness was clearly not Eleanor's motivation. "The thing is, my dear, people are talking, and not kindly, I'm afraid." Eleanor settled into a chair without being invited, arranging her skirts with practiced precision. "Many are questioning the wisdom of Caleb's choice, given the dramatic circumstances. Some are even suggesting that your sister's arrival exposed certain uncomfortable truths about the arrangement." Lydia's spine stiffened. "What truths would those be?" "Well, that you're essentially a replacement, a substitute for the woman Caleb originally contracted to marry." Eleanor's tone was all false sympathy. "It creates an awkward dynamic, doesn't it? Everyone wondering if he's simply making the best of a bad situation rather than admitting he made a mistake." The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. Lydia felt the old familiar doubts resurface, the lifetime of being second best, the nagging voice that whispered she wasn't enough. But then she remembered Caleb's hand in hers at the Sutherland party, his absolute certainty when he'd told Charlotte she was wanted and Lydia was chosen, the ring on her finger that he'd been carrying for a week, waiting for the right moment. "Mrs. Sutherland," Lydia said, her voice level despite the anger simmering beneath it. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in gossip or speculation about my engagement. Caleb and I understand our relationship, and that's all that matters." Eleanor's expression cooled. "How admirably naive. But you'll learn soon enough that in a place like this, what people think does matter. Reputation affects business relationships, social standing, even economic opportunities. If the community believes Caleb settled for you out of desperation rather than genuine preference, it reflects poorly on both of you. Then the community will have to adjust their beliefs based on our actions rather than their assumptions," Lydia replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have household matters to attend to." It was a clear dismissal, and Eleanor knew it. She rose with deliberate slowness, her smile frozen. "Of course. I wouldn't want to keep you from your duties, though I do hope you'll remember that I tried to warn you. When things become difficult, and they will, don't say I didn't offer guidance." After Eleanor left, Lydia sat alone in the parlor, her hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of confrontation. She'd never stood up to someone like Eleanor Sutherland before, had never defended herself with such firmness. It felt both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. Mrs. Reeves appeared in the doorway. "I apologize for showing her in, miss. I should have turned her away." "You couldn't have known she'd come to make trouble." Lydia looked up at the housekeeper. "Was she right? About people questioning Caleb's judgment?" Mrs. Reeves' expression softened. People always question decisions they don't understand, but I've worked for Mr. Rollins long enough to know he doesn't make choices lightly, and he doesn't care much what others think once he's decided on a course of action. If he says he wants you, then he wants you. The rest is just noise. The third visitor arrived before dinner, a messenger from town with a telegram. Lydia's hand shook as she opened it, dreading news from her parents about Charlotte's dramatic return and Lydia's betrayal. But the telegram was from her father, and it contained only 4 words: contract fulfilled, debt settled. No congratulations, no expression of happiness for her engagement, just a cold acknowledgement that she'd served her purpose, that the family obligation had been discharged. Lydia crumpled the telegram in her fist, feeling the last threads of connection to her old life snap like rotten rope. She was truly alone now. No family support, no fallback plan, no safety net if this gamble on Caleb Rollins proved to be a mistake. But when Caleb came in from the range that evening, dusty and tired but with eyes that lit up when they found her, Lydia thought maybe being alone wasn't the same as being abandoned. Maybe choosing herself meant accepting that some bridges would burn behind her. "Rough day?" Caleb asked, noting her expression. Eleanor Sutherland paid a visit. Caleb's jaw tightened. What did she want? "To make sure I understood that people are talking, that my presence here is causing controversy, that I'm damaging your reputation." Lydia showed him the crumpled telegram. "And my father sent his regards, or rather, his confirmation that I've fulfilled my obligation." Caleb read the telegram, his expression darkening. "Your father is a fool. He had 2 daughters, one who ran away from responsibility and one who faced it head on. He should be proud of you, not treating you like a transaction completed." "He's never been proud of me. Charlotte was always the one worth celebrating." Lydia took the telegram back, smoothing it out despite herself. "I think part of me hoped that choosing me over her would make him see my value. But he doesn't. He probably never will." "Then he's blind as well as foolish." Caleb caught her hand, his thumb brushing over the sapphire ring. "But his blindness doesn't change the truth, Lydia. You have value. You've always had value. Some people just lack the wisdom to recognize it." Over the following weeks, the pattern Eleanor had predicted played out with uncomfortable accuracy. Several of Caleb's business associates became suddenly distant, finding reasons to postpone meetings or route their cattle through different buyers. Invitations that would normally have arrived for ranch social events stopped coming. When Lydia accompanied Caleb into town for supplies, she felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. But not everyone turned away. Tom Hayes, the ranch foreman, became an unexpected ally. The weathered Cowboy started including Lydia in daily operation briefings, explaining the intricacies of herd management and seasonal planning with patient detail. When some of the younger ranch hands questioned why the boss's fiancée needed to know about cattle rotation patterns, Tom shut them down with a look that could freeze water. "Miss Hawthorne is going to be running this ranch alongside Mr. Rollins," Tom said firmly. "Any man who has a problem with that can collect his wages and find work elsewhere. Clear?" It was clear. The hands might grumble privately, but they respected Tom's judgment enough to give Lydia a fair chance. Mrs. Chen proved equally supportive in her own way. The cook started teaching Lydia the complexities of feeding a large operation, showing her how to stretch supplies without sacrificing nutrition, how to plan menus that satisfied hungry workers without breaking the budget. During these sessions in the warm kitchen, Mrs. Chen shared pieces of her own story, how she'd come to Montana as a young immigrant, how she'd built a reputation through skill and determination, how she'd learned to ignore people who judged her for being different. "They'll always find something to criticize," Mrs. Chen said one afternoon while teaching Lydia to make bread for 60 men. "Too foreign, too plain, too educated, too quiet. The list is endless. You can't live your life trying to satisfy people who've already decided you're not enough. You just do your work, prove your worth through actions, and let the critics choke on their own bile." Even Mrs. Reeves, initially so stern and formal, began to soften. Lydia caught the housekeeper defending her to a visiting tradesman, correcting the man's assumption that Lydia was merely decorative rather than functional. "Miss Hawthorne manages these accounts better than anyone I've seen," Mrs. Reeves said sharply, "including the previous bookkeeper Mr. Rollins had to dismiss for incompetence. If you have business with this household, you'll deal with her respectfully or not at all. But the support of household staff and ranch hands, while meaningful, couldn't entirely shield Lydia from the social consequences of her engagement. The real test came when Caleb had to attend a regional Ranchers Association meeting in Helena, a 3-day affair that would involve significant business negotiations and social obligations. "I want you to come with me," Caleb said over dinner one evening. "These meetings are where a lot of important deals get made, where relationships are built that affect the ranch's success for years. As my fiancé, you should be there." Lydia's stomach clenched. "Will Eleanor Sutherland be there?" "Almost certainly. James is on the association board, so Eleanor usually attends to manage the social aspects." Caleb's expression was serious. "I won't lie to you, Lydia. It will be difficult. People will be watching, judging, comparing you to whatever image they've built of the perfect rancher's wife. But running from it won't make it easier. We need to face this head on, show them we're a united front." "What if I embarrass you? What if I say something wrong or wear the wrong thing or—" "You won't," Caleb interrupted. "You're smarter than half the men who will be in that room and more capable than most of their wives. The only way you could embarrass me is if you pretended to be something you're not. Just be yourself, Lydia. That's all I'm asking." They left for Helena on a cold November morning, taking the train this time instead of riding. Lydia watched the Montana landscape roll past, remembering her first journey west just 6 weeks earlier. She'd been so frightened then, so certain she was heading toward failure and disappointment. Now she was heading toward the same society that had judged her wanting, but she was no longer the terrified woman who'd stepped off the train in Blackridge. She'd learned to ride, to manage household operations, to stand her ground when challenged. She wore a sapphire ring that meant someone had chosen her deliberately, not desperately. That had to count for something. The Grandview Hotel in Helena was elegant and imposing, full of well-dressed ranchers and their equally polished wives. Caleb had reserved a suite, and Lydia tried not to think about the propriety of sharing accommodations before marriage. But Caleb made no assumptions, showing her to a separate bedroom and maintaining the same respectful distance he'd observed since she'd arrived at Blackridge. The first evening was a formal dinner for association members and their families. Lydia dressed carefully in a deep burgundy gown Mrs. Kowalski had finished just before they left, her dark hair arranged in the elegant style Mary had taught her. When she emerged from her room, Caleb was waiting in the suite sitting area, and the expression on his face when he saw her made her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd used that word about her, and Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mrs. Kowalski is an excellent dressmaker." "Mrs. Kowalski made a fine dress. You make it beautiful." Caleb offered his arm. "Ready?" The dining room was full of the territory's ranching elite, and Lydia felt their assessment the moment she entered. She caught sight of Eleanor Sutherland holding court near the far windows, surrounded by other society women. Eleanor's eyes found Lydia immediately, and her smile was all predatory satisfaction. But Caroline Mitchell was also there, and she broke away from her group to greet them warmly. "Lydia, Caleb, I'm so glad you came. I was worried you might skip this year after all the nonsense following the dinner party." "We considered it," Caleb admitted, "but hiding seemed like the wrong approach." "Absolutely right. The best way to handle gossip is to face it directly and refuse to be ashamed." Caroline linked her arm through Lydia's. "Come, let me introduce you to some people who have actual sense and decency, unlike certain individuals I could name." The evening was a test of endurance. Lydia fielded questions about her background, her adjustment to Montana, her wedding plans with as much grace as she could muster. Some people were genuinely welcoming, interested in getting to know her as a person, rather than as a curiosity. Others were clearly there to evaluate and find wanting, their polite questions hiding sharp judgments. Eleanor approached midway through dinner, James Sutherland trailing behind her with an expression of resigned forbearance. "Miss Hawthorne, how lovely to see you again. I trust you've recovered from the shock of your sister's dramatic appearance?" Eleanor's voice carried just enough to attract the attention of nearby tables. "Completely," Lydia said evenly. "It was certainly unexpected, but ultimately it clarified matters quite well." "Oh yes, quite clarified." Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though I must say, the whole situation does raise interesting questions about modern courtship practices. Mail-order brides are so fraught with potential complications, aren't they? One never quite knows what one is getting until it's too late. James Sutherland looked pained. Eleanor, perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue. I'm simply making conversation, James. Surely Miss Hawthorne doesn't mind discussing her unique circumstances. Eleanor turned back to Lydia. Tell me, dear, how does it feel knowing you weren't Caleb's first choice? That he originally wanted your sister? I imagine that creates a certain awkwardness in the relationship. The room had gone quiet, people at surrounding tables frankly eavesdropping now. Lydia felt Caleb tense beside her, felt him preparing to intervene, but she placed a hand on his arm to stop him. This was her fight to have. Mrs. Sutherland, you're laboring under a misapprehension, Lydia said clearly. Caleb didn't originally want my sister. He wanted someone capable, educated, and willing to work, qualities the marriage broker identified in me, not Charlotte. My sister was offered because my father assumed beauty was what mattered most. Caleb knew about the substitution before I arrived and chose to meet me anyway. So no, I wasn't second choice. I was always the choice, once Caleb had accurate information rather than my father's assumptions. She stood, her voice carrying across the now silent dining room. As for modern courtship practices, I find your concern touching but misplaced. You married James because your families had adjacent properties and consolidating land made economic sense. I'm marrying Caleb because we've spent weeks getting to know each other, learning if we're compatible, building a genuine partnership. If anything, my courtship has been more modern and less fraught with complications than yours, since at least Caleb and I chose each other rather than being arranged by families concerned with property rights. The silence was absolute. Eleanor's face had gone white, then red, her carefully maintained composure cracking. James Sutherland's expression was a fascinating mixture of shock and poorly suppressed amusement. Caleb stood beside Lydia, his hand finding hers. Well said. Eleanor, I think this conversation has run its course. Perhaps you should find another table to grace with your insights. It was a clear dismissal, and coming from Caleb, one of the association's largest landowners and most respected members, it carried weight. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it again, then turned and walked away with as much dignity as she could salvage. The dining room slowly returned to normal conversation, but Lydia could feel the shift in atmosphere. She'd stood up to Eleanor Sutherland publicly, had defended herself in her engagement, had refused to be shamed or diminished, and people had noticed. After dinner, as they walked back to their suite, Caleb pulled Lydia into an alcove away from other guests. His eyes were intense, his expression serious. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed, he said. Which do you think it was? Brave. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. Incredibly, magnificently brave. Eleanor Sutherland has been terrorizing this social circle for 20 years, and you just dismantled her in under 2 minutes. I probably made an enemy for life, Lydia said, though her heart was racing at his touch, at his proximity. You already had an enemy, now you also have respect. Caleb's voice dropped lower. And you have me completely in awe of you. He leaned down, and for a breathless moment Lydia thought he might kiss her. But he stopped just short, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her lips. Not yet, he murmured. Not until we're married properly. But soon, Lydia, soon. The rest of the conference passed in a blur. Lydia attended business sessions with Caleb, taking notes on negotiations and market discussions with the efficiency she'd honed keeping her father's books. She met with other ranchers' wives for tea and planning sessions, holding her own in conversations about household management and community organization. She navigated social dinners and gatherings with increasing confidence, no longer shrinking from scrutiny, but meeting it head-on. And everywhere she went, Caleb was beside her, a steady presence, a silent support, a partner in every sense of the word. On their last evening in Helena, they took a walk through the hotel gardens despite the November cold. Snow had started falling, light flakes that caught in Lydia's dark hair and melted on Caleb's shoulders. Thank you, Caleb said suddenly. Lydia looked up at him in surprise. For what? For being brave when I needed you to be. For standing beside me this week. For proving to everyone, including yourself, that you belong here. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. When I sent for a bride, I was thinking practically. I needed help managing the ranch, someone capable and reliable. I wasn't expecting to find a partner in the truest sense, someone who would challenge me, support me, stand with me against whatever comes. Is that what you found? Lydia asked quietly. Yes. His voice was certain. That's exactly what I found. They stood in the snowy garden, the hotel's lights warm behind them, the future spreading out uncertain and challenging before them. Lydia thought about everything that had brought her to this moment: Charlotte's abandonment, her father's desperation, her own decision to be honest instead of hiding. All of it had led here, to a snowy Montana evening, with a man who saw her value when no one else had. When do you want to get married? Lydia asked. Caleb's expression softened. As soon as we get home, if you're willing. I don't need a big ceremony or months of planning. I just need you. Then let's make it simple. A quiet ceremony. Just the people who matter. No spectacle or apology. No spectacle or apology, Caleb agreed. Just us, choosing each other. When they returned to Blackridge Ranch 2 days later, they found the household in an uproar. Charlotte had apparently returned to the ranch during their absence, demanding to speak with Caleb and creating a scene when Mrs. Reeves refused her entry. Tom Hayes had been called from the bunkhouse to physically escort her off the property. She was screaming about being cheated, about you stealing what was rightfully hers, Mrs. Reeves reported grimly. I told her Mr. Rollins had made his choice clear and she needed to leave. She didn't take it well. Where did she go? Lydia asked. Back to town, I assume. One of the hands said she had luggage with her at the general store, like she'd been staying there. Mrs. Reeves' expression was troubled. Miss Hawthorne, she seemed quite desperate. I'm concerned she might try something drastic. But Charlotte didn't return. Instead, a week later, Lydia received a letter forwarded from Pennsylvania. It was from her mother, and the contents made Lydia's hands shake. Charlotte had returned home penniless, abandoned by the Reverend's son after his family refused to accept the marriage. She'd come to Montana hoping to reclaim the contract and the financial security it represented. Now she was back in Pennsylvania, living with their parents again, a social pariah who'd destroyed her own reputation through her choices. Their mother's letter was bitter, blaming Lydia for not helping Charlotte, for choosing her own happiness over family loyalty, for being selfish and ungrateful after everything they'd sacrificed. Lydia read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace and fed it to the flames. Bad news? Caleb asked, appearing in the doorway. Closure, Lydia corrected. My mother thinks I should have given up my engagement to save Charlotte from the consequences of her own decisions. And what do you think? Lydia watched the letter curl and blacken in the fire. I think I spent 22 years putting everyone else's needs before my own. I think Charlotte made her choices and needs to live with them, and I think I'm done apologizing for having the audacity to choose myself. Caleb crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, the first time he'd held her like this. Lydia leaned into his solid warmth, letting herself be supported, letting herself accept comfort without guilt. Good, he said into her hair, because I'm going to be very selfish about keeping you. They married 3 weeks later in early December, in a simple ceremony at the ranch with just the household staff, Tom Hayes, Caroline and her husband as witnesses. The minister from town performed the service in the Blackridge parlor, and Lydia wore a dress of deep blue velvet that Mrs. Kowalski had created as a wedding gift. There was no grand celebration, no society spectacle, no attempt to court approval. Just vows spoken honestly, promises made deliberately, and two people choosing each other with full knowledge of what that choice entailed. When Caleb kissed her for the first time as her husband, Lydia tasted promise and commitment, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected but both had chosen to build. That night, as snow fell softly outside their window and the ranch settled into winter quiet, Lydia lay beside the man who had seen past her plainness to her substance, who had valued her strength over her sister's beauty, who had chosen her not once but repeatedly. And she understood finally, completely, that she had never been a replacement. She had always been exactly what was needed. She had always been enough. Winter settled over Blackridge Ranch like a promise kept, the snow transforming the vast Montana landscape into something both brutal and beautiful. Lydia woke each morning in the room she now shared with Caleb, watching pale sunlight filter through frost-covered windows, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking around them. The household staff moving through their morning routines, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of barn doors opening as the hands began their daily work. Being married was different than she'd expected. Not the awkward arrangement she'd feared, not the cold business partnership she'd braced herself for, but something warmer and more complex. Caleb was considerate without being distant, affectionate without being presumptuous, treating their growing intimacy as something to be built carefully rather than assumed as a right. He still left before dawn most mornings to work with the hands, but he always kissed her goodbye first, his lips warm against her temple. He still came home exhausted most evenings, but he always asked about her day, listened to her observations about the household operations or the accounts, valued her input on decisions that affected the ranch. And slowly, deliberately, they learned each other. The way Caleb took his coffee, black and strong, the way he rubbed his left shoulder when it ached from old injuries, the way his eyes crinkled when something genuinely amused him, the way Lydia preferred morning quiet before conversation, the way she unconsciously tucked hair behind her ear when concentrating, the way she hummed while working on difficult accounting problems. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of intimate knowledge that built foundations. But the outside world wasn't ready to let them settle into peaceful domesticity. 2 weeks after the wedding, Caleb received a letter from the Montana Cattlemen's Association informing him that several members had raised concerns about his business practices and requesting a formal review of his operations. The letter was professionally worded, but the implication was clear. Someone was trying to damage his reputation and undermine his standing in the ranching community. Caleb read the letter at breakfast, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set it down carefully, his jaw tight. "Eleanor Sutherland," he said flatly. "How do you know?" Lydia asked, though she wasn't surprised. "Because this kind of petty revenge is exactly her style. She can't attack me directly without looking vindictive, so she's using the association to create problems. Questions about my business practices, suggestions that I'm not managing the ranch properly, implications that my judgment might be compromised." He tapped the letter. It's all very carefully phrased to sound like legitimate concern rather than personal vendetta. Lydia felt anger rise hot in her chest. Can she actually cause real problems? If enough association members support the review, yes. They could make it difficult to sell cattle, could discourage suppliers from working with us, could essentially isolate Blackridge from the cooperative networks that make large-scale ranching viable. Caleb's voice was grim. I've worked 12 years to build relationships in this territory. Eleanor could damage a lot of that if she's determined enough. Then we fight back, Lydia said firmly. Caleb looked at her, something flickering in his blue eyes. We? Of course we. I'm your wife now. Your problems are my problems. Lydia reached across the table and took his hand. What do we need to do? Over the next several days, they worked together to prepare for the association review. Lydia dove into the ranch's financial records, organizing years of transactions into clear, comprehensive documentation. She created detailed reports showing Blackridge's profitability, its consistent fair dealing with suppliers and buyers, its excellent track record with employees. Caleb gathered testimonials from ranch hands, letters from satisfied business partners, evidence of his contributions to the regional cattle industry. Tom Hayes proved invaluable, rallying support among other foremen and workers who respected Caleb's management style. Mrs. Chen wrote a surprisingly eloquent letter about the ranch's treatment of its staff. Even Mrs. Reeves contributed, documenting the household's efficient operations and ethical practices. But their most unexpected ally came from an unlikely source. James Sutherland appeared at Blackridge Ranch one cold January afternoon, his weathered face troubled as Mrs. Reeves showed him into Caleb's office, where both Lydia and Caleb were working. "James," Caleb said, standing, "this is unexpected." "I know. I probably shouldn't be here." James removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "But I couldn't let this continue without saying something. This review Eleanor's pushing for. It's wrong, Caleb. Everyone knows it's personal, knows she's using association business to settle a grudge." Caleb's expression remained neutral. "Are you here to warn me or to help me?" "Both, I hope." James sat down heavily. "Eleanor's been working on several board members. convincing them that you're too independent, that you don't respect the association's authority, that your unorthodox marriage proves questionable judgment. She's got 3 members ready to support formal sanctions if the review finds any irregularities. Will it find irregularities? Lydia asked quietly. James looked at her, and his expression was kind. No, ma'am. Caleb runs the cleanest operation in the territory. That's what makes this whole thing so frustrating. Eleanor's not attacking him because he's done anything wrong. She's attacking him because he embarrassed her by choosing you. He paused. And because you stood up to her and Helena and made her look foolish in front of people whose opinions she values. So what do we do? Caleb asked. You come to the review prepared to defend yourself, which I know you're already doing, but you also need allies on the board willing to speak up against this witch hunt. James met Caleb's eyes. I'm one of those allies. I've already talked to Robert Chen and Michael Foster. They're disgusted with Eleanor's tactics and ready to vote against sanctions regardless of what the review shows. That's 3 board members on your side. That's not a majority, Caleb pointed out. No, but it's a start. And if you can show up with overwhelming evidence of your competence and integrity, the other members will be hard-pressed to support Eleanor's vendetta. James stood. I'm risking my marriage by being here, Caleb. Eleanor will be furious if she finds out I warned you. But some things matter more than domestic peace, and one of them is standing against injustice. After James left, Lydia and Caleb sat in silence for a long moment. Then Lydia said, We need to do more than just defend ourselves. We need to go on offense. Caleb raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? Eleanor's using her social influence to damage us professionally. We should use our professional competence to undermine her social authority. Lydia pulled out her notes. I've been reviewing the association's financial records. They're public information, available to any member. Eleanor manages the association's social fund, the money used for community events and charitable activities. And her bookkeeping is terrible. Not fraudulent exactly, but sloppy and inefficient. Money being wasted on unnecessary expenses, duplicate purchases, inflated vendor costs. Nothing illegal, but definitely poor management. Lydia looked up. What if we presented an alternative proposal at the review, offered to help reorganize the association's financial systems, improve efficiency, save money that could be used for actual community benefit? Caleb's eyes lit with understanding. We'd be demonstrating competence while simultaneously exposing Eleanor's inadequacies, not as a direct attack, but as a helpful suggestion. Exactly. It makes us look constructive and community-minded while making her look careless by comparison. Lydia allowed herself a small smile. And it's honest. The association's finances really could be better managed. Over the next 3 weeks, they refined their strategy. Lydia created a comprehensive analysis of the association's financial practices, complete with recommendations for improvement. Caleb gathered supporting documentation for every aspect of Blackridge's operations. They rehearsed their presentation, anticipated hostile questions, prepared responses that were firm without being defensive. Caroline Mitchell visited regularly, offering encouragement and insider intelligence about board dynamics. Other ranchers began reaching out quietly, expressing support and disgust with Eleanor's tactics. The community was splitting, and not necessarily along the lines Eleanor had expected. The formal review was scheduled for the first week of February at the association's meeting hall in Helena. Lydia and Caleb traveled to the city together, checking into the same hotel where they'd stayed during the conference, but this time the atmosphere was tense with anticipation rather than cautious optimism. The night before the review, Lydia couldn't sleep. She paced their suite, reviewing her notes, second-guessing their strategy. Caleb finally caught her hand and pulled her to sit beside him. We've done everything we can, he said quietly. The work speaks for itself. Either the board will recognize that, or they won't. But whatever happens, we face it together. I'm scared, Lydia admitted. Not for me, for you. You've built Blackridge from nothing. If Eleanor succeeds in isolating you from the association's networks, then we'll adapt. We'll find new markets, build new relationships, prove ourselves through results rather than politics. Caleb's hand cupped her cheek. I've faced worse than Eleanor Sutherland's petty vindictiveness, Lydia. I've faced poverty, failure, winters that killed half my herd. This is just another challenge, and this time I'm not facing it alone. The review hearing began at 9 o'clock the next morning. The association meeting hall was formal and intimidating, with a long table at the front where the 7 board members sat, and rows of chairs for observers. At least 30 people had shown up to watch, including Eleanor Sutherland, who sat in the front row wearing an expression of confident satisfaction. The board chairman, an older rancher named William Hartford, called the meeting to order. We're here to conduct a formal review of Black Ridge Ranch's operations, as requested by several association members who have raised concerns about business practices and management decisions. Mr. Rollins, you and your wife may present your documentation. Caleb stood, his bearing confident and professional. Thank you, Chairman Hartford. My wife has prepared a comprehensive overview of Black Ridge's operations and financial records. With your permission, she'll walk you through the documentation. There was a moment of surprise. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly not expecting Lydia to take an active role. But Hartford nodded and Lydia stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. For the next hour, she presented their case, financial records showing consistent profitability and ethical business practices, testimonials from employees, suppliers, and buyers, documentation of Black Ridge's contributions to the regional economy, its fair treatment of workers, its reliable fulfillment of contracts. She answered questions with precision, backed every claim with evidence, and demonstrated a command of ranching economics that clearly surprised the board. When she finished, Hartford leaned back in his chair. That's very thorough, Mrs. Rollins. I must say your financial management appears exemplary. Thank you, sir. Managing complex operations requires attention to detail and systematic organization, which brings me to a related matter. Lydia pulled out her analysis of the association's finances. While preparing our documentation, I reviewed the association's public financial records. I noticed several areas where efficiency could be improved and costs reduced. With the board's permission, I'd like to present some recommendations. She could feel Eleanor's fury radiating from the front row, but Hartford looked intrigued. Please proceed. Lydia walked the board through her analysis, pointing out wasteful spending, duplicate expenses, and opportunities for better vendor negotiations. She was careful to frame everything constructively, focusing on solutions rather than criticism. But the implications were clear. The association's finances were being poorly managed. These recommendations could save the association approximately 30% on social event costs annually, Lydia concluded. That money could be redirected to community improvement projects or charitable activities that would benefit the entire ranching region. Hartford studied the documents with interest. This is impressive work, Mrs. Rollins. You've clearly put considerable thought into this analysis. Eleanor Sutherland stood abruptly. Chairman Hartford, with all due respect, we're here to review Black Ridge Ranch, not to criticize association management. Mrs. Rollins's suggestions, while perhaps well-intentioned, are outside the scope of this hearing. Are they? Hartford's voice was mild, but his eyes were sharp. The concerns raised about Black Ridge included questions about judgment and management competence. Mrs. Rollins has just demonstrated exceptional analytical skills and financial expertise. It seems quite relevant to the review. James Sutherland spoke up from his board seat. I move that we acknowledge Black Ridge Ranch has satisfactorily addressed all concerns raised and close this review with a finding of no irregularities. Seconded, said Robert Chen immediately. Eleanor's face went white. You can't simply dismiss this review without proper investigation. Mrs. Sutherland, you're not a board member, and you don't have standing to object, Hartford interrupted. The motion has been made and seconded. All in favor? 5 hands went up, a clear majority. Eleanor's carefully orchestrated attack had collapsed in the face of overwhelming evidence and growing board frustration with her manipulations. Hartford banged his gavel. The motion carries. This review is closed with a finding that Black Ridge Ranch operates with exemplary business practices and financial management. Furthermore, I'd like to propose that we invite Mrs. Rollins to serve as a consultant on association financial reorganization. Her analysis suggests significant opportunities for improvement. The meeting dissolved into general conversation, board members approaching to congratulate Caleb and discuss Lydia's recommendations. Eleanor sat frozen in her seat, her perfect composure finally shattered. When she finally stood and swept from the room, no one followed her. James Sutherland approached them cautiously. Well done, both of you. That was a masterclass in turning defense into offense. Thank you for your support, Caleb said, shaking his hand. I know it cost you. It'll cost me some domestic peace, certainly, but Eleanor needed to learn that she can't bully people indefinitely. Sometimes you have to stand up to tyrants, even when they share your bed. James smiled ruefully. Besides, maybe having her influence checked will actually improve our marriage in the long run. Over the following months, things changed. Eleanor Sutherland's social authority, once absolute, began to crumble as more people found the courage to resist her manipulations. Caroline Mitchell organized an alternative social circle that was more welcoming and less hierarchical. The association implemented several of Lydia's financial recommendations, saving money and improving community programs. Blackridge Ranch flourished. Caleb's business relationships, tested by Eleanor's attacks, proved resilient and even strengthened as people saw how he'd handled the crisis. New contracts came in, new opportunities opened up, and the ranch's reputation for integrity and competence grew. But more than the external successes, Lydia felt herself growing into her role in ways she'd never imagined possible. She took on more responsibility for ranch management, working with Tom Hayes to improve operational efficiency. She began attending association meetings regularly, contributing insights that other ranchers valued. She built genuine friendships with women like Caroline, relationships based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. And her marriage to Caleb deepened into something neither of them had anticipated. The careful partnership they'd started with evolved into genuine intimacy, trust, and eventually love. Not the dramatic, sweeping romance of novels, but something steadier and more enduring, a love built on shared work, mutual respect, and daily choices to support each other. Spring came to Montana in a rush of melting snow and new grass, and with it came a letter from Pennsylvania. Lydia's mother wrote to inform her that Charlotte had married a merchant's son. A decent match, if not as advantageous as the Rollins contract would have been. The letter contained no apology for previous criticisms, no acknowledgement that Lydia had made the right choice, just cold facts and a perfunctory closing. Lydia read the letter once, then filed it away without responding. Charlotte's life was no longer her concern. Her mother's approval was no longer something she craved. She'd built a new life, a better life, and the people in it valued her for who she actually was. 2 years after her arrival in Montana, Lydia stood on the porch of Blackridge Ranch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Behind her, the house was warm with lamplight and the sounds of dinner being prepared. Caleb would be back soon from checking the herd, would wash up and join her for their evening meal, would tell her about his day while she shared the decisions she'd made managing the household and reviewing supply contracts. It was ordinary. It was routine. It was everything she'd never known she wanted. Mrs. Rollins, Mary appeared in the doorway. Dinner's ready whenever you are. Thank you, Mary. I'll be in shortly. Lydia looked down at her hands, work roughened now, strong from daily labor, wearing the sapphire ring that had fit her perfectly from the first moment Caleb had placed it there. These were the hands that had kept her father's books, that had learned to manage a ranch's complex operations, that had defended her worth in front of hostile society women. These were hands that had chosen, that had fought, that had built something real. She heard hoofbeats and turned to see Caleb riding in from the north pasture, his black gelding moving with easy familiarity toward the barn. He spotted her on the porch and raised a hand in greeting, his smile visible even at a distance. Lydia's heart swelled with something she could finally name without hesitation. Not gratitude for being chosen, not relief at being valued, but simple, honest love for the man who'd seen her when everyone else looked past her. The man who'd offered her choice when everyone else demanded obligation. The man who'd become her partner in every sense that mattered. She went inside to wait for him, to share their evening meal and plan for tomorrow's work and laugh at Mrs. Chen's wry observations about the new ranch hand who thought he knew everything. To live the life she'd chosen, with the man who'd chosen her right back. Years later, when people asked Lydia about her marriage, about how a mail-order bride arrangement had become one of the territory's strongest partnerships, she would always tell them the truth. She hadn't been rescued. She'd been recognized. And recognition, it turned out, was worth more than any amount of beauty, more valuable than any conventional advantage. Because recognition meant someone saw you clearly. all your strengths and weaknesses, all your capabilities and fears, and chose you anyway. Not as a replacement, not as a consolation prize, not as a substitute for something better, but as yourself. Complex, flawed, capable, real. And that choice, freely made and daily renewed, had transformed everything. The ranch continued to grow, expanding its operations and influence. Lydia became known throughout the territory as a shrewd businesswoman and a voice of reason in association politics. Together, she and Caleb built something that lasted, something that mattered, something that proved the worth of honest work and genuine partnership. But more than any external success, Lydia treasured the quiet moments. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, hands linked while reviewing accounts together, the weight of Caleb's arm around her shoulders as they stood watching storms roll across the plains, small gestures of affection and respect that accumulated into a life worth living. She'd come to Montana expecting tolerance at best, rejection at worst. She'd found neither. She'd found home. And standing on the porch of Black Ridge Ranch each evening, watching the sun set over the land she'd learned to love, wearing the ring of the man who'd chosen her deliberately and kept choosing her daily, Lydia understood the fundamental truth that had reshaped her entire existence. She had never been the wrong woman sent west. She had always been exactly the woman who needed to make this journey. And the life she'd built in Montana, the partnership she'd formed with Caleb, the person she'd become through struggle and growth and deliberate choice, all of it proved that being overlooked, being underestimated, being dismissed as inadequate had never been the truth about her worth. It had only been other people's failure to recognize what was there all along. Lydia Hawthorne Rollins was strong, capable, valuable, and chosen. Not in spite of who she was, but because of it, and that made all the difference.